All right, I see it's 11:01, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the 2025 Northeast RISC Symposium. My name is Bethany Bradley, and I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and also a member of the RISC leadership team. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that 2025 has been a really hard year for people working in environmental fields. We've lost what feels like a generation of truly outstanding young scientists and practitioners in recent federal firings, and we're anticipating that there are more losses to come. Federal scientists and practitioners are key partners in the RISC network, and their work is critical for environmental conservation and for climate adaptation. On top of this, those of us at universities depend on federal funding to do the research that serves the RISC network. So much of our research support for RISC comes through the USGS, through the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Our science is threatened by firings of federal staff at funding agencies, combined with executive decisions to curtail funding that supports climate science. So, with a deep breath, even with these challenges, I really find strength in this network. I see all of you. We see all of you. We see that we're still here, that we still care deeply about our lands and our waters. We care deeply about our forests and our seashores, and we care deeply about each other. This is the first year that we solicited talks to the symposium, and we had a lot of contributed talks. I'm looking forward to learning about more of the good work that we're doing, and I was really gratified to be reminded that there are more of us than we think out there doing this great work. The work that we're doing is meaningful and valuable and incredibly necessary. The RISC leadership team is largely a volunteer organization, and we'll do our best in the years ahead to keep this work going and to keep supporting the RISC network. In particular, I want to thank Emily Pastorero, who's the Program Development Coordinator with the Invasive Species Centre in Ontario, Canada, and Matt Fertakos, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Matt and Emily co-chaired the organization of the RISC Symposium this year, so please take a moment in the chat to appreciate them and the folks on the leadership team, most of whom are early career researchers. I'd also invite you in the chat to appreciate our friends and colleagues who work for the federal government and each other. Their work and your work make the RISC network possible. So on to some housekeeping. We're using Zoom meeting format so that everybody can participate in this conversation. Everyone can add information, knowledge to the chat and share with each other. But just as a reminder, you have the ability to unmute yourself at any time, so watch out for that, and please stay muted when you're not speaking. We're also recording and posting these presentations and discussions, so a warning that if you turn your video on, you may be recorded. We've enabled closed captioning for this meeting, so in your Zoom window towards the bottom, you should see a button like this to show captions if you want to show closed captions. Those may also be in the three little dots of the More section in your RISC window. We welcome chat. We welcome everybody to please feel free to use the chat to exchange information during the presentations. After the presentations, during questions and answers, we'll be moderating between questions that are posted in the chat. So you can post a question in the chat at any point during the presentation, and the moderators will reflect back on these. You're also welcome to raise your hand at the end, and we can call on you directly. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to first go through some of the activities that RISC has led over this past year. As a reminder, our work focuses on 4 key areas: synthesizing relevant science, sharing the needs and knowledge of managers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, and conducting priority research. So starting with that synthesis of relevant science, Our main product this year was a research to practice paper. We've renamed those. We used to call them management challenges, and now we're calling them research to practice papers. This one focused on how shifting phenology or seasonality of biological events, how shifting phenology in response to climate change could affect the timing and efficacy of management. And we can drop a link to finding that resource in the chat. We also host coffee talks so that we can share and discuss our synthesis products. So this is an example of a coffee talk led by Dan Boniuto, who led that research to practice paper. In terms of sharing the needs and knowledge of managers, we also host discussions with experts on specific species so that practitioners and scientists can learn from the experience of others. So here's an example of one that we did that last year on knotweed management and climate resilience. In 2024, we also held a couple of listening sessions for the first time. The goals of these were to help inform the direction of future research before those research projects got started, and to understand key knowledge gaps that the research team of RISC could potentially fill. So thanks very much to those of you who were able to attend one of those and share your ideas and thoughts. To build stronger networks, one of the big activities we do is this symposium. So we really hope that you'll write down some of the names of speakers and participants so that you can contact them later, or share that information in the chat. Another area of work is our coordination of a community of practice of folks who are part of state invasive plant councils. That goes across the Northeast and even into Eastern Canada. And the goal of that is to share information about invasive species regulations and practices across borders. Just recently, we've also launched a LinkedIn page as another space where you can connect to the RISC community. So if you're on LinkedIn, please check that out and use it to share opportunities. And Matt just dropped that link in the chat as well. And you can also grab the link from the QR code on this slide. And lastly, we're active in research in response to the priorities that you tell us about. So here are just a couple of examples of research papers that were published in the past year. These research papers were all ones that are in support of the RISC community. And you can also find summaries of each of these papers, as well as several others that were published in the last year on the RISC website. All right, so with that, I am really delighted to introduce Catherine Jarnevich as our keynote speaker. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that Catherine can share her screen. Catherine is a research ecologist at the USGS Fort Collins Science Center in Colorado. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of New Mexico and a PhD from Colorado State University. Her research uses habitat suitability models to answer applied research and management questions for invasive species. And Catherine's team developed a model called Inhabit, which is a state-of-the-art approach to predicting the potential distributions of invasive species. Catherine is a fantastic and generous collaborator and one of the many federal employees affected by the various executive orders. So please send your good thoughts her way and enjoy her talk, which is entitled Predicting Invasive Species Future Distributions to Inform Early Detection and Control. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Bethany. And thanks for inviting me to present some of the work that we've been doing here. First, I want to acknowledge that everything I'm going to talk about this morning, there's been a really large group of people contributing to this effort, including some people from the Northeast RISC, several with USGS that I have listed here, and then partners from several different federal agencies as well. And so what I want to talk to you about this morning, Bethany mentioned Inhabit, is kind of the evolution of that web tool and some of the latest work that we've been doing as requested by some of our practitioner community. some of which was just completed last week with a little delayed schedule with everything going on right now. So with that, I'll kind of dive right in. Okay, so there's lots of location data for, I think I skipped a slide. Okay, so there's lots of location data for invasive species that are out there. So there's wonderful databases that aggregate occurrence information, such as EDD maps, IMAP invasives, there's the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And so this information gives us an idea of where species are right now, at least where people are looking for them. So there's lots of location data, but people don't look for invasive plants everywhere. So there could be gaps in where they're looking for things. We know invasive species spread over time, and there are around 4,000 introduced vascular plant species based on the US Register for Introduced and Invasive Species. And that's a lot of species for anybody to try to keep track of and monitor. And so these graphics here are just kind of illustrating that, where the top one just shows the number of first records. And what I mean by that is for each of those roughly 4,000 species, we went and looked and found the earliest record we could for each of those. So when did they first appear within the United States? And as we can see, those have been increasing over time. And then the bottom graphic is a similar concept, but it's the first record for introduced species within different national park units. And so each one of those lines is a different national park. And the takeaway here again is just that the number of species the number of non-native species that are recorded in national parks over time are still increasing. And so the question is, where should we look for species? And so my research group's done a lot over the years working with managers and climate scientists and soil scientists and others to try to predict the potential distribution of invasive species on landscapes that could then be used by managers to help in their management activities. And so we came up with this concept for Inhabit, or the Invasive Species Habitat Tool, and it's a web application with mapped and tabular summaries of habitat suitability models for right now 259 terrestrial invasive plant species of concern across the contiguous United States. And it's the product of a scientist-practitioner partnership and is designed to facilitate enhanced invasive species management actions, including species watch lists and targeted searches. And the idea for Inhabit actually came about when my research group was sitting down with Terry Hogan and Jen Siraki at the National Park Service, who kind of lead the Park Service invasive plant management teams. And we were talking about what their needs were and what could help those teams do their work more efficiently and effectively in relation to what we did. And so that's how we came up with this idea. So the idea for Inhabit first came about in 2018, and we met with the invasive plant management teams and got an idea of what might be most useful for them. And so this web tool has really evolved over time, both in the way it looks. So I have some images on the right there, and also with the content itself. And one thing I want to point out in the different dates I have in this kind of timeline is that we do have these somewhat regular partner meetings where interested people are invited to join, talk about the future of Inhabit. So what's missing, what else do we need? And also what changes we can make to the web tool itself to make it more understandable and more useful for people. So again, it's been around for 2018. It's really evolved over time. And so again, what Inhabit has had is where might species be expected to occur. And so here's an example map from the web tool where you can select a species and you can get this continuous map of predicted suitability for the contiguous United States. So I wanted to show the invasion curve just to give an idea of where inhabit could be helpful. And so what this is showing is time across the x-axis. And we have both the area impacted by the invasive species shown here and the cost and harm related to that species. And so it moves from prevention, so preventing the introduction of species, to where you could have eradication, containment, and long-term management. And we have use cases for managers at different points along this curve. So where species are already widespread and established, there may be within a management unit still trying to prevent further spread or managing the populations that exist. And so in that case, managers have used inhabit to those maps to help them go and find new populations on the landscape that they might not have known existed. But inhabit can also provide information earlier in that curve, thinking about early detection and rapid response activities and providing information on what species should we be looking for. So of those around 4,000 vascular plant species that have been introduced to the US, what might we be most worried about at our particular location? So we have the map within inhabit, and another tab that we have are these management summaries. And so you could get a management summary by a species. So select a species of interest and get summary information for that species for all management units that we have within the web tool. Or you could select a management summary unit and get summaries for all 259 species that we have models for. And so what I'm showing here is just a screenshot where we selected Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and we have the list of species. And then we have a summary of the amount of area that's suitable, predicted to be suitable within that management unit. And then we also integrate this with information on where we know species occur. So taking all the information from those databases I mentioned earlier, like EDD maps, and say how many records for this species have already been recorded in a unit. How many records have been recorded within 50 miles, within 100 miles? How far is it to the nearest known record? And so using this combination of information, we can filter species lists. So we can say how many species have suitability within this unit. We could further filter that and say how many species have suitability within the unit but haven't yet been recorded within that unit. And so those might be kind of watch list species. We came up with another concept of species that we call at the doorstep. And these are species that have suitability in a unit, haven't been recorded there, but have been recorded nearby. And this subset people have found useful as kind of a starting point for developing a watch list. So they may have better local information about what's actually recorded in the unit. So like, oh, actually, we already know this species is here. But there's still some on that list that they may not know are in the unit yet, and they could be on the lookout for. And then another concept we've been thinking about is more kind of a regional EDRR list. And so with this, we've been thinking about what species are suitable within a unit that maybe haven't been recorded within the larger region. So that could be a species that has suitability within a county that hasn't yet been recorded within the entire state. And so maybe the state's interested in trying to keep that out. So what does this look like as far as coming up with watch lists? So here's just an example where I'm showing maps of the number of species that meet these different criteria for watersheds. And so what I'm showing here is by columns, I have the number of species with suitability for occurrence, the number of species with suitability for abundance, number of species with suitability for high abundance. And then the number of species by row is the number of species with suitability, with novel suitability, so they're suitable in a unit but haven't been recorded there. The number of species that are at the doorstep, so they have suitability within that polygon unit, but haven't been recorded in that unit, but have been recorded nearby. And then what I'm calling neighbor early detection rapid response, so the number of species that have suitability within the unit but haven't been recorded, say in like that entire watershed. And so just looking from left to right, you can see there's a decrease in the number of species, and then the top row has more species than when you do those further filtering. And so this is just showing that you can come up with watch lists that are tailored to meet a certain question that have a smaller number that could be useful. So as I mentioned earlier, co-production is a big piece of the Inhabit web tool. So we have these somewhat regular meetings with people interested in Inhabit. We also have meetings with specific groups of managers, so presenting the web tool to invasive plant management teams of the Park Service and getting feedback, presenting the tool to BLM state weed coordinators and getting feedback. And one thing we ask about is what's missing. So with the initial Inhabit web tool, people often ask, what about where we don't care about a species? So I'm showing a screenshot here of, where cheatgrass has been recorded in, according to the USDA plants database. And you can see it's been recorded everywhere, but we don't really care about it in the Northeast because it's not having the same impacts that it does in the Western US. We've also been asked, what about changing environmental conditions? So climate's changing, land use is changing. There's a lot of different factors that are changing. So how might that affect suitability in the future? Inhabit was initially focused on terrestrial plant species, and we've been asked about other taxa groups and ecosystems. So what about aquatic species? What about reptiles? And then another question that people have asked is, how could a species get to a suitable location? So we have these maps of suitability. We have some information on where things are found now. Is there some piece of information that's missing that we could provide related to risk that would say something about how likely something is to move to a new location where it's suitable? So first I'm going to address what about where we don't care about a species. So with the latest release, we have abundance models. And so what this is addressing is on the, I have some photos I took in a forest in Pennsylvania. On the right, it's what the forest has historically looked like. And on the left and on the right, we have grass has invaded this forest landscape and covered the understory there. And so here you can see it's highly abundant. And we know that the cost of the impact of an invasive species is related to how much there is. So as abundance increases, impacts increase. And while there may be different relationships between those, that positive relationship tends to hold. Oops. So we added in abundance models. And again, because increasing abundance relates to increasing impact. So within this latest version of Inhabit, we have models for occurrence. So wherever the species is found, which is what we always had before. And then we took from these aggregated data sets any information on cover and tried to assign them to different cover classes. And the abundance data is rather messy. We don't have great information about kind of the unit that the cover was taken over. A lot of it's qualitative data rather than quantitative data. And so trying to create a true abundance model where we could predict what percent cover we would expect for a species on the landscape is really difficult to do. And so Eve Bury led some work looking at ways that we could use what abundance data there is to come up with these models. And then we adapted that for this latest Inhabit release. And so we came up with 2 different abundance cover class levels based on input from managers and also what it was easiest to map the abundance information that existed to. So we have models for where species could become abundant. And so we use any occurrence information that had 5% cover or greater to fit those models. And then we have models where species could become highly abundant. And that would be using any information where a species had 25% cover or greater. And you'll note, I said earlier, we had 259 species in the Inhabit tool now. But when we add in abundance information, not all species have abundance or highly abundant information available. So we had 217 model species that we were able to fit abundance models for, and 189 that we were able to fit high abundance models. And then we also have information, we are able to create a categorical threshold model. So we start with the continuous predictions, and we could choose some value along that continuum to say that a location is suitable or unsuitable, and then use that information to come up with this integrated categorical model that shows where you have suitability for high abundance, suitability for abundance, suitability for occurrence. And so these are subsets of each other. So with these 259 models, we can also look at what information that fed into the models was important. And so we had these different predictor variables covering disturbance, temperature, water, the substrate like soils. And we can look at, for these 259 species, which of these predictors were the most important in predicting where the species would be on the landscape. And so the top performing individual predictors included human modification of the landscape and minimum winter temperature. And then when we group these predictors together, the most influential predictor groups included disturbance, temperature, and atmospheric water. And so climate variables came out as being some of the most important predictors, unsurprisingly, within these models. So what about changing environmental conditions? What about when these predictors change? And so we worked with Annette Evans with the Northeast RISC and others to predict shifting hotspots of invasive plants in the eastern US. And so we started with the USDA plants database, introduced species list, and we selected any species that had at least 50 records with 5% cover or greater that were east of 100 degrees longitude. So these were the East Coast species. And then we chose climate variables that were highly important in Inhabit. So these included 8 temperature and precipitation variables that we could use to fit these models. And so with this, we are able to fit models for 138 species using similar methodology to Inhabit. And we could come up with this hotspot map showing suitability for those 138 species under current conditions. And then we also had future conditions with a scenario of 2-degree increase and 4-degree increase. And so with this, we could look at how these hotspots might be shifting over time. So comparing the map on the left with the one on the right, we see that the Northeast has an increase in the number of species with suitability under these future conditions. And then we can also look at for the individual species underneath and see that some species have increasing suitability with future conditions. Some tend to maintain suitability over time. So the purple color, and then on the right, there are also some species that seem to decrease suitability over time. So the blue color. But they all had shifts in their overall distributions. So we've also been asked over the years, what about other taxa groups and ecosystems? So we had a new project that was looking at predicting invasive species distributions within freshwater systems. So we had our existing template for terrestrial ecosystems. That's that green map in the upper right. And then we built models for freshwater that we divided into lentic and lotic systems, thinking that the predictors that might be important in those were different. So top I have lakes, the bottom streams, and then a zoomed in version showing these three overlaid together and how we can now fill in the entire landscape if we use these. And so with this project, we had funding from the Northeast CASC to think about what species currently in the Southeast or the Midwest we might be worried about moving into the Northeast with changing environmental conditions. And so we met with a group of stakeholders and elicited species of concern. So what species were people worried about that were already in the Southeast or the Midwest, and they were concerned about moving into the Northeast? And we ended up with a list that covered 3 different taxonomic groups, so fish, invertebrates, and plants, for a total of 111 species to fit models for. And because we were thinking about freshwater environments, we had a different set of predictor variables that we were interested in. And so these included climate variables for which we had future predictions. We had evapotranspiration, we had a human modification index, we had land use classification that we had future predictions for as well. Topography, soil, stream flow, again, we had future predictions for that predictor. And then shore density for lakes. And so we used similar methodology to inhabit, but with these climate layers fit in. We fit a model for lakes separately from streams, and then we could combine those together to make a map of potential suitability across species. So here are maps for continuous suitability under current conditions. And so I have a couple different example species that I'm showing here. And these include brown trout and alligator weed. So a plant and a fish species. And the other thing I want to mention is everything I've talked about up to this point is either within an habit or already released. And this is a new project that is just wrapping up. And so hopefully these products will be out soon. So here's the looking at the entire Eastern US, and then we can zoom in to some areas so you can see the differences in predicted suitability. And so these models were run at a 90-meter resolution, which is similar to the Inhabit web tool. And then we also have the potential future conditions that I mentioned earlier, so including abiotic conditions and the land use changes. And so again, here's relative suitability for those. And I just saw someone pop up in the chat what's going on with Indiana and making it stick out, and that the data set that we used to create our templates for lakes and streams were the NHD plus data. And within that data set, Indiana had just done a lot better job of capturing where these features occurred on the landscape. And so that's why Indiana pops out more, is because there's a better delineation of water bodies within that state. And again, we can zoom in to those same areas and see what the future conditions predict for brown trout and alligator weed. And then we can take that current and future predictions and look we can take those forecasted suitability and look at uncertainty related to those. So for stream flow and land use, we had only one potential future condition, but for the climate data, we had 5 different GCMs that we used. And so we have an ensemble across all of those. So we can take the average across all those potential future conditions and look at what that looks like. So that's what I'm showing on the left. And then on the right, we can look at what's the standard deviation in that suitability prediction. So we can get an idea of what the uncertainty is at a particular location on the landscape. And so here, the yellow colors, you have a standard deviation of 49, which is half of the 0 to 100 values. So maybe at those locations, you might have a lot less faith in what those future predictions are telling you than some of the other areas that have a much lower standard deviation. And then again, we were working in aquatic environments. And so for a lot of the summaries that we're producing, we're using what are called hydrologic units. And so these are derived from the National Hydrography Dataset Plus version 2. And we use these both to summarize the outputs that we had, but also to apply some of the terrestrial predictors to water bodies. We summarize some of these to a HUC-12 layer. And so the hydrologic units are just nested ways of subdividing the landscape. And so you can start with the 2-digit hydrologic unit, which are all shown up at the top, that are kind of watersheds. And then those are further subdivided until you get down to the bottom where we have 12-digit hydrologic units. And so that's what a lot of the rest of these summaries that I'm going to show you are going to be. And so with Inhabit, there are those management summary tables. And so we haven't completed producing these yet for these aquatic predictions, but we plan to make these available by HUC-12 for each species, or by each species for HUC-12. So the 2 different ways that you can filter and Inhabit now. But we've talked about including the species, the percent of the water within the HUC that's suitable. So HUCs cover the entire landscape, but how much of a HUC is water, either lake or stream. And then information on the suitability. So we thought about integrating these across current and future conditions. So we could say suitable always, unsuitable always, suitable future, suitable now. And then the suitability uncertainty. So I showed that kind of standard deviation earlier from the predictions. And so we want to capture when you apply the model to the different potential future conditions, is it always the same? So you get the same answer that it's, so for row 2, it's always unsuitable no matter what. Or for row 1, it's got, as an example, a mixed future. So one set of future conditions say that it's going to be suitable. One set of future conditions say that it's going to be unsuitable. And so that's a key piece of information just moving forward about kind of the uncertainty around these predictions that hopefully could be helpful to people. And I just want to take a kind of sidestep to say why this is important. So this was some work led by Helen Sofair this was using breeding bird survey data. But the reason we went to that is because there's a lot of great data over time. And so we could train habitat suitability models using data from the 1970s. And then we could apply those models to conditions in the 2010s and really tell how well do these predictions work. And so the map shows where the routes were that we were able to use. So we had a lot of routes we could use to estimate the model. And then the validation ones were ones that the same routes had data collected in the 70s and in the 2010s. And then the graphic here is just showing the number of species with different values of AUC, or area under the curve, which just is an assessment metric to say how well models are performing. And really a value over 0.7 means that a model's performing pretty well. And so for all of the species that we modeled, the models did a really good job. So just looking at assessment metrics, we'd say these models were great. But again, we knew what happened in the 2010s, and we were able to assess how well things did. And so what I'm showing here is across the x-axis, we have gain, loss, always, never. So a gain means that it's suitable in the future, but not now. A loss means that it's suitable currently, but not in the future. Always, it's always suitable. Never, it's never suitable. And what I want to highlight here is that we did a really great job at capturing where things were stable. So if you look at never, the biggest bar is never. So we predicted that the species would never be there, and it wasn't. For always, the biggest bar is green. So we predicted that it would always be there, and it always was. But when you get to the gain and loss piece, we did a lot worse job at predicting what happened. And so this just shows that at least for that breeding bird data, when we create these habitat suitability models, we didn't do a great job at capturing where things changed. And so that's one reason that we want to provide that uncertainty information and have people think about that, is because we don't necessarily do a great job at predicting where those things change. So the last piece that I want to talk about is related to movement. So when we think about where species are found on the landscape, this diagram called a BAM diagram is a way that people think about where things can and can't be found. So we have a circle of kind of biotic conditions. So these could be interactions with other species that control where a species is found. We have the red circle that's abiotic conditions, which includes kind of those environmental conditions, so climate, soils, that sort of information. And then we have this third piece that's movement. So can a species get to a location? And so where the biotic and abiotic circles overlap, that's kind of the invadable area. But where species actually are includes that movement component. So are they able to get to a location? And so with this aquatics project, we also want to think about pathways for the species to get into the Northeast, as well as where it's suitable or not. And so we came up with a list of aquatic invasion pathways. And some of these we thought were species agnostic in that they don't depend necessarily on the identity of the species. So species could hitchhike on boats, trailers, equipment, and whether or not a species might be moved that way relates to the species, but the overall layer of that we would come up with to represent hitchhiking on boats, trailers, equipment wouldn't be different based on the species. Then we have release or escape from captivity, water gardens, aquaculture live bait, hitchhike on or in waterfowl, movement through canals and water pipes that might be connecting watersheds that otherwise wouldn't be connected. And then one other pathway that we thought of is move in flooding waters, and we haven't come up with a layer for that one yet. So I have the layers shown here that we created for these different pathways. So we have a boat ramp density, and there's some places that have really high densities, but there's very few of those, so you can't see much in that graphic. We also have what we're calling a remoteness index to get at where things are most likely to be released or escape from captivity. And so this uses information on population centers and then routes for people to get from those population centers to different points on the landscape, using roads, trails, and other things. So the more people you have, the closer to a location would have higher values. And then for hitchhike on or in waterfowl, we decided to just use the amount of permanent water within HUC 12 to summarize that. So if you have more permanent water, then you might be more likely to have waterfowl landing there. And then for the move in canals and water pipes, we counted the number of anthropogenic features that link hydrologic unit code 4, so kind of a higher level of watershed, to each other. And so we can see kind of one of the highest areas for that is down in Florida. And then we also had species-specific pathways. So thinking about where is a species already in a watershed, and what's the connectivity of those locations where it's already found to other hydrologic units. So thinking that it's easy for species to move downstream. And so that's this kind of connectivity layer. So then we could add, kind of normalize those values for each of those pathways from 0 to 1, decide whether or not a pathway was important for a particular species, and then add those together to come up with an overall index for movement via pathways. So we have this composite score that I'm showing here for brown trout and alligator weed again. And so then thinking about kind of overall aquatic invasion risk, we decided risk is a function of this pathway composite plus the current suitability plus the forecasted suitability. Thinking about species that have lots of pathways, have suitability currently and in the future, those might be the ones that we're most concerned about and that we'd want to have this kind of highest risk score. And so we can add those together and we come up with these maps here for brown trout and for alligator weed. And we can see that the patterns here are different as to where that those highest risks are. And one thing I'm going to point out here is please ignore the Great Lakes in these models. We meant to remove those because they are just very different from everywhere else, but I didn't get that done for these maps that I was just creating last week. And then finally, the last thing that we can do is come up with these kind of aquatic invasion risk by taxa. So these maps here are showing those these aquatic invasion risk for each species, all added together to come up with an overall risk score for invasive fish, for invertebrates, and for plant species. And so with that, thanks a lot for listening. I have a QR code here to sign up for our newsletters related to Inhabit. And then if you're also interested in learning more about the Inhabit web tool and what's included in that, there's a QR code to an overview that was created that's on our USGS website. And with that, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Catherine. Really appreciate that great presentation. And you've got some appreciation in the chat too. I'm going to say, why don't you leave this slide up so that folks can access those different websites. And we did drop a link to the Inhabit tool in the chat a little earlier on too. All right, so I'm going to start going through questions that are posted in the chat. But if you've got a question that you'd like to ask live, you can also raise your hand in the reaction tool. There's a raise hand option in there, and I can call on you that way. All right, awesome. So there was a question that we actually that got answered a little bit in the chat too, but Catherine, I just wanted for everybody to hear it and for the recording to hear it, which was a question about the data that are available on EDMAPS, the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. And we know that there are some maps on there for both current and future projections for different species. Which of those are the same as the ones that you talked about, and which of those are different?
So I know there's the maps I presented that I said Annette Evans had led. Those are available via EDMAPS. And then there's also links from EDMAPS to the Inhabit models, but those are just for current conditions right now.
Just for current, perfect. And then the other link that's available on the EDMAPS site in the same, so basically if you go to the map and the county data presentation in EDMAPS, you can find all of those. There's also a future range map, which is an older tool that was actually created by Jenica Allen about 10 years ago. So that is current and future occurrence. And then like Catherine said, the abundance one is current and future abundance. All right, super. We had another question about, like how common, really love the tool that you've been developing. And one of our network noted that the USDA has also been doing some distribution modeling, maybe with Tony Coop's group, at least in the early 2000s, and whether you know whether that's continuing and what other programs like this, if any, exist across the US.
So the work with Tony Coop, at least what I know of, and I may be incorrect here, but a lot of what I know that group has done is thinking about species that aren't necessarily yet established in the US and doing more risk. And then I think they also do some work for species established here, but I don't know the details for that. With Inhabit, we did get some bipartisan infrastructure law funding from the US Forest Service to try to make Inhabit better meet the needs of the Forest Service, because a lot of our initial work was with Department of Interior land management agencies, and but that work has been paused right now. And I don't know if I know of any other kind of national scale efforts beyond what has been said is on EDMAPS already, and then the work.
Super, thanks. Yeah, I don't think I know of any others either. I would say the Inhabit tool is the main stop for doing these types of suitability models. Another question was about the climate predictor layers that you're using in the Inhabit tool, and the question was specifically about growing degree days or some other metric of days over a certain temperature, and whether that has come out as important as an important predictor for any or many of your species?
We didn't have growing degree days included. And sorry, I meant to include a slide of what predictors we had and I missed that. But we do have different climate predictors summed over different seasons. So, but really the minimum winter temperature seemed to be the most important, followed by some of the precipitation ones. But those again are tailored to specific species. So when we model an invasive annual grass, the kind of precipitation that we're considering is kind of that overwinter precipitation that might be important for that species versus, you know, a tree species in the eastern US, we may be more concerned with annual precipitation. So those are kind of tailored by species.
Super, thanks. There was another question about resolution. So the question was framed as how far can we zoom in on some of these maps, but maybe I'll also add the question on top of that of, you know, given that your breeding bird survey data of how much we trust the like expansion and contraction pieces, like how far should we be trusting individual pixels on these maps?
So with the Inhabit tool, I can't remember how far you can zoom in on there, but the underlying models that are available for download are at a 90-meter resolution. And again, that's just current information. For the aquatic models that we're creating, we're fitting the models at a 90-meter resolution, but I think most of the outputs are going to be summarized to that kind of HUC 12 level. And again, hopefully that kind of alleviates some of the issues from those uncertainties available. And then the models that I mentioned by Annette Evans that you can find on EDD maps, those were at a 4-kilometer resolution.
Awesome, thanks. Maybe I think if anybody else has questions they'd like to put in the chat, we still have a couple more minutes, but I also have a question, which is, you know, you mentioned early on that a lot of the great application of the model is to identify places where we have a lot of uncertainty and we don't know whether species are there yet. So I'm curious for this audience, like what should people be doing to try to fill in those gaps? You know, like how can boots on the ground help with your models?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I showed at the beginning of my presentation, there's a lot of data aggregators out there like EDD maps. And so contributing any information you collect to those systems means that that information will be included in future iterations of Inhabit. So we have our version 4 that was released in September. And with each one of those versions, we've made some changes and improvements. And one of those is including the latest occurrence information that's available. And so that can definitely help. Fantastic.
Yeah, and if you're familiar with the EDD maps, like Catherine said earlier, you can link directly out for given species to the Inhabit tool from those. So there's easy back and forth between them. All right, well, we're right at noon. So everybody who's, you know, if you're in the chat and want to give Catherine a applause, please go ahead and do that. We're going to take a break now for lunch on the East Coast, and we will be back in 40 minutes. So we'll be starting again at 12:40 Eastern time with some contributed sessions this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
In the chat?
I'm not chatting. I mean, this whole thing is funded by USGS. So what I want
Welcome back. We're gonna get started on our next session. So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch break and are ready to dive back into some great talks we have planned for the afternoon. My name is Matt. I'm a member of the Risk Leadership Team, and I'll be moderating our next session, which is all about co-production. We have two researcher practitioner pairs who will each highlight a research project and discuss some of the benefits and challenges to co-produce science at the intersection of invasive species and climate change. Each talk will be roughly 20 minutes, followed by a few minutes of questions and answers. So please feel free to write your questions in the chat during the presentation, or you can wait to raise your hand during the Q&A portion, and we will call on you to unmute. The last 10 minutes of the session are reserved for a combined discussion between all four of the presenters. So you'll have a chance to ask more questions then if we don't get to them at the end of each individual talk. So now I'm excited to introduce our first set of speakers, Dr. Peter Clark, a research associate faculty member at the University of Vermont, and Rick Morrill, a consulting forester with Northern Forest Conservation Services in Vermont, who will both be presenting on operationalizing and co-producing assisted migration in the Northeast forest region. Take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, let me just get some slides going. And I just want to take this opportunity to say thanks for having us here, and special thanks to Rick. He's been a great partner to work with over the years, and it's really it means a lot to be able to work with partners that you can trust and have good conversations with, to be able to make the decisions around restoring and adapting our ecosystems. So as Matt said, we'll be talking about this idea of assisted migration, and applying that to the northern forest region. And what does it mean to operationalize or turn this into a practice that's more routine use, so bringing from theory into practice into the region. And so I'll just set the stage by sharing some of the background and some of the science and some of the thinking, and then I'll end up passing the baton to Rick, as he will help frame what does it mean in terms of some of the projects that we've been working on. So just to set the stage, many of us recognize that plants move in correspondence to their climate and associated habitats. And so these figures are lake pollen records, just illustrating the movement of plant communities in southern New England over the last 15,000 years. And what we recognize is that historic dispersal rates are on average of 1/10 to around 1/3 of a mile annually. Trees and different species may have different dispersal rates. Comparing this to the rate of climate and how those climate regimes are shifting, that's on the order of around 4 to 6 miles annually. Really, the takeaway here is that climate change far exceeds the ability for natural plant migrations to be able to keep pace, and leading to some phenological mismatches. If we look to USDA, Forest Service, tree atlas models, what we see is that the Northeastern region, the figure on your left is potential infill. These are species that are on site that may become more abundant. The Northeast has a few of these species, but really we're left to the Mississippi River in southern states where those species may be able to naturally infill. Relative to the Northeast, on the right figure, the migration potential. So we're talking about shifting species habitats here. So these are species that are not on site that potentially have an increase in habitat, with potential corresponding declines in species that are on site that may be less adapted to a future climate. Still, there are biophysical challenges to forests, sessile organisms, natural regeneration for adaptation. And this conceptual diagram just really tries to convey that as we move into a warmer, different climate, forests may move into what we're thinking about maybe a novelty domain. So that may lead to declines in forest health, productivity, or really what we're talking about today is regeneration. So that future establishment and the demographics of future forests. And we know that seedlings are a critical filter in the establishment of future forests. And so if those naturally native species are struggling to be able to regenerate and naturally adapt, we can lead to a shift into potentially a different ecosystem state. And so just as an example, we know that seedlings require some pretty basic functions to be able to establish. Many of them are light associated. And just looking at the shade tolerance or the ability for plants to be able to grow in different light environments, currently adapted tree species in the Northeast tend to be a bit more shade tolerant relative to future adapted species tend to be a bit less shade tolerant, so requiring maybe higher light environments. And so for a seed to be able to migrate across the landscape, land in a receptive seed bed, those light requirements may need to shift. So thinking about disturbance regimes or harvested gaps and things like that. So there have been management strategies to be able to respond to adaptation. We call these adaptation tree plantings. These could be for differing objectives. They could be for carbon mitigation or maybe the restoration or replacement of species that have been lost to be able to promote diversification or resilience. Or really the topic that we're talking about today is assisted migration. But within this cup there, we think about tree plantings for adaptations as a potential management strategy to be able to respond to these things. And so we can look to generalized transfer distances. These are from historic provenance trials, and we generally know that species performance tends to be pretty closely linked to parent seed source. But trees can generally tolerate a few degrees of transfer without loss in terms of total fitness. Fitness can be survival or growth or some sort of bud break or other phenological responses. But as we start to move in terms of higher degrees of latitudinal transfer, that performance in terms of fitness tends to decline a bit. So here we're just looking at a 2-degree, a potential 4-degree transfer, and I just use Vermont, which is where I'm based, as an example of about 150 miles, so 2 degrees or so. Now we compare this to different emissions scenarios. So this is a seed collection zones under climate change. So the pin would be a potential planting site that you're looking at in central New Hampshire, and where you may want to target potential seed collections under different emission scenarios. So the upper figure would be low emissions, the lower figure would be high emissions. And again, remember that trees are sessile organisms, so they're not going to just pick up their bags and move. So collecting those seeds from a different seed zone that may be adapted to the end of the century. And what we can see is that these distances, potential seed zone distances become increasingly farther and farther and more southern from these planting sites. And again, these are generalized model simulations. So when we talk about assisted migration really comes in a few different, I'd call them food groups or options, and they increase in terms of degrees of risk. And so it's important to be able to differentiate these rather than the broad scale movement of plants across the landscape. So the first food group or type is assisted population expansion. This is the movement of climate adapted genotypes within the species current range, but maybe movements to be able to respond to that species adaptability. And this is something that we've been doing in forestry for long periods of time, finding climate adapted, wet adapted, disturbance adapted species or genotypes and moving them within their current ranges. Assisted range expansion, sort of a middle of the road approach. This is the movement of species to new locations near the current range where it is currently expected to naturally migrate over long time frames. So this is the modest movement of a species, perhaps northward. So maybe an oak hickory forest with modest movements north into a northern hardwood system. There are examples of this from tribal communities, particularly with seed-bearing and mass trees, and moving those populations north to be able to cultivate for those food sources and other services. But this tends to be I guess a critical part of this is that there are few natural migration barriers, and we expect these species to be able to move into these areas over some longer time frame. Comparing this to assisted species migration, or what we think about as the translocation of exotics, this is the movement of species beyond areas that would really ever be possible via natural migration, even over long time frames. And so there's some sort of natural migration boundary via ocean, mountain range, desert, that would prevent these species to be able to move there. And so we can see the presentation of these different types of assisted migration increasing with a degrees of risk. So when we survey managers and early adopters, we really try to understand what are the perspectives of these early adopters and what are the challenges that folks are dealing with in terms of operationalizing and bringing this into practice. And this is a busy slide, but what we're looking at are different types of tree planting for climate adaptation. And managers report that they generally expect an increase in tree planting in response to global change. Again, remembering that in the Northeast, this is not a practice that we have historically done all that much. And many of them have plans or are interested in some types of assisted migration, but really not that translocation of exotics or that assisted species migration. So as we think about operationalizing and co-producing assisted migration into the future, working with managers and being able to understand how to localize these simulations. So here we have a gridded projection of species habitat increase over the future. These are 20 by 20 kilometer cells. Really localizing that to the stand level is an important part of making these decisions. So scientists and managers being able to work together to understand the soils, potential refugia of sites, thinking about north slopes or cold air drainages that can serve as refugia for local genotypes or species. And then conversely, thinking about those really vulnerable sites that may be candidates for this type of reforestation effort due to the risk of inaction. Oftentimes when working with managers, we think about taking a portfolio or a functional diversity approach. So what are the potential functions that an ecosystem may be lost due to the declines in species? And if you're applying assisted migration, are there ways in which you can provide functional redundancy to be able to provide that carbohydrate-rich seed or improving that overstory habitat with replacement species that may be adapted that provide similar functional approaches. And then adaptation plantings are complementary, not discrete options. They are combined within good forestry. It's really impossible to really reforest the entire landscape. So really prioritizing ecological function and using these types of plantings as potential source nodes going into the future. As we think about co-producing, bringing science from theory into practice, really having a reciprocal relationship with managers is really one of the ways in which we can improve the relevance and applicability of this practice. That ultimately, this reduces risks, this improves the decision-making on the ground. And by incorporating a monitoring component, we can reduce the uncertainty in terms of maladaptions or a healthy forest into the future. Also, having a reciprocal relationship with managers, we work with forest nurseries a lot. This improves that knowledge exchange and really responding to developing actionable science that managers need to be able to respond to unprecedented change. In this work, we're working with managers and nurseries to be able to improve a market signal, to be able to provide increase the diversity of seed sources and species that are available relative to maybe the traditional workhorse species that are available. And then lastly, improving best management practices on the ground. And then lastly, working with stakeholders improves engagement and improves relevancy, legitimacy, and uptake of newer climate adaptation practices relative to maybe traditional reforestation practices. So at this point, I'll stop talking and I'll pass the baton to Rick and take it away, Rick.
Thanks, Pete. That was, yeah. I just learned a bunch, so that was really good. I'm glad I can be part of this. So I think, is there one slide back, Pete?
No, this is the first slide I have from you. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. I'll just start saying again, my name is Rick Morrill. I'm a consulting forester in northern Vermont. I work with my wife, who's an ecologist, and father-in-law, who's also a forester. He's been working in the woods for over 50 years, which is great when you're looking for a resource to try to understand the forest that I'm dealing with. He's got a good historical perspective on it. We work mostly in north central Vermont, so about 50 miles from the Canadian border, and in a forest that looks often like this, a mixed species forest, so a mixture of conifer and deciduous species in all different arrangements, and including pure deciduous and pure conifer. We have about 25,000 acres that we manage, mostly concentrated in 4 or 5 towns, and represents about 200 clients. So most of which are private, and we have some NGO clients. Next slide, Pete. And so a lot of our forest looks like this when there's ample sunlight for regeneration, and we don't have any shortage of regeneration. So you could ask the question, then go to the next slide, Pete. Ask the question, why would we want to plant? And what I'll try to do is to hit on these core themes of why we want to plant, focused on climate, wildlife, and wood supply rationales, but then also try to answer the what, where, how, and then some of the challenges that we might face. So next slide, Pete. Sorry, I'm clicking myself, so
You're good.
which one I'm on. So I think everybody in the Northeast and probably most of the country at this point is pretty familiar with images that look like this. This probably happened somewhere in your own community. But when flooding like this occurs, especially flooding that we can really tie to climate change, I think everybody starts looking for a way to respond. And next slide, Pete. So for landowners, planting trees is a response. It may be a small one, but it can feel real and feel like a tangible thing that people can do when otherwise it often feels pretty overwhelming, what we're facing. So next slide. Related to that idea of responding directly to climate is the idea of restoration. And in this case, a picture of red spruce, a tree I think both Pete and I have an affinity for, and one that was historically abundant in our region, but was pretty systematically removed through overharvest and also agricultural use. And so thinking about how do we bring that back into our future forest. So next slide, please. One thing that we're able to do with the help of Pete and his shop is have access to seed sources for red spruce. So if we're interested in planting it, Pete's helped us connect to seed source that's coming from the southern end of the range of red spruce, which is down in the higher elevations in the southern Alps. And so hopefully those individuals are going to do well in a future climate here. Next slide. And help us have forests that includes historically abundant species, but in a new form that will hopefully be well adapted to a future climate and be able to thrive in that climate. So next beat. So beyond climate and the idea of restoration, lots of landowners are interested in wildlife. It's a strong motivator for lots of aspects of management. And if we just take one example, beech, it's been hallmark mast species of the northern forest. Beech has lots of challenges. Everybody knows about beech bark disease, but there's some new issues on the horizon. So you can raise questions of what's the future of beech. And since it provides such a key food source for bear, deer, lots of small mammals and all their predators, it's a big open question. So next. So with that uncertain future, we may consider doing something like we've done here, where location that had a lot of diseased beech, we've removed that and are planting red oak seedlings in their place. So this is a long game, but hopefully we're going to have next slide, Pete, something that looks like this, where we can start to recruit that red oak into the at least a sapling class, and then next slide. Hopefully have a forest that has mature red oak that are producing lots of mast on an annual basis. So if we're lucky, that'll be part of the future. So next slide, Pete. So the other reason, or third reason, that landowners and foresters are interested in planting is about wood production. There's a great report called The Illusion of, or Beyond the Illusion of Preservation. Tony D'Amato and Caitlin Littlefielder and others are authors on that. And that really speaks to the wood supply question in the Northeast. So if you haven't looked at that, you should. Next slide, Pete. And probably most folks are aware of a real acute housing shortage in much of the Northeast and more broadly. That's a very real pressing issue in Vermont. Houses are made of wood. So when you look at the guts of them, there's lots of wood in there, in all different forms. So next slide, Pete. That wood comes from the forest, comes from plantations, potentially, lots of different forms. Next. And when we harvest that, it can turn into future housing stock. So next slide. So with these three ideas, what species are we going to choose to fulfill, some or multiple categories? And this is a very simple matrix, no science behind this, just my own experience and with ideas from folks like Pete. But species like red oak, white pine, red spruce can really fit into multiple categories from climate, wildlife, and wood supply. And then there's others that we might want to explore that may have more of just a climate element, like black birch or basswood, and then things that may have more just habitat value, like cedar. Pete's already brought up Norway spruce. Hopefully we're not offending anybody in a conference that's partly about invasive species to talk about a species that's obviously not native, although I think fortunately Norway spruce doesn't behave in an invasive way. But Norway spruce is a robust timber species, doesn't have that invasive character, and it may be something we want to consider in the mix as a form of assisted migration. So next slide, Pete. So then the question becomes, where do we plant? And two sort of easy answers to that are either in the woods, and Pete sort of alluded to that we might be planting in gaps. We need to think about the light regimes that are there. Some species are going to want do better in shade, some in more full sun. So that's one option. And the other would be in former agricultural lands that maybe underutilized, but where we can add species that are going to sequester carbon, add habitat, and potentially wood supply in those kinds of locations. So next, Pete. So then there's a question of how do we get trees in the ground? And labor's expensive, definitely in short supply. And so one answer to that is using volunteers and landowners themselves to do that planting. There's also questions about, are we using plugs or bare root? I think plugs are definitely much faster. Had some really good experiences with them last year with some help from Pete. And bare root is slower, although potentially more accessible. So there's pros and cons there to what type of planting stock you're going to use. Go to the next slide, Pete. With volunteers, if we can have many hands, it definitely shortens the work load and the time spent doing it. We've worked with Craftsbury Outdoor Center, which is here in northern Vermont. Last year we planted about 1,400 trees using help from over 20 athletes that they have in different programs at the center. Hoping to repeat that work this year, and then separately but along the same lines, hoping to do some work with a local housing trust with volunteers planting trees for climate and wood supply or future housing goals in mind. Next. There's plenty of challenges to getting this kind of stuff done on the ground, including access to planting stock and that type of thing. One example of challenges run into is how do you get 200 oak seedlings half mile back in the woods? One answer is to find a jet sled and a former professional ski athlete who doesn't mind towing that sled uphill a long way. And we managed to get these trees in the ground in about 3 hours or less. So, so it's possible. So next slide. So the logistics are definitely, you know, a real challenge. There's a lot of moving parts. There's only so many hours in the day and a narrow planting season window to get it all done. So there's, you know, those classic operational issues of time are probably maybe the most important ones. Next slide. But if we're lucky, we can get trees in the ground and accomplish a bunch of our goals, maybe have some fun along the way. And so again, thanks to Pete for his help in a bunch of our work with different landowners, and pleased to be able to be part of this conference and see if answer any questions for either me or Pete. So thanks.
Rick.
Thank you, Pete and Rick. That was great. We don't have time for questions right now. There are some in the chat if you want to respond to them in the meantime, and we'll have you both rejoin us for the last 10 minutes of the session for the discussion portion. Maybe we can address some of them.
Sounds good, Matt. Thanks.
Thank you both. We're now going to move on to our second presentation. As before, feel free to type questions in the chat or wait for the Q&A portion to raise your hand. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Scotty Yang, an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, and Dr. Cal Ivanov, curator at the Virginia Museum of Natural History, who will be talking with us about fire ant wars, Virginia's expanding front, and lessons for the future.
Hey, can everybody hear me? Good? Yes. Okay. I'm just gonna go ahead and start. But first of all, I want to ask all of you in the chat, how many of you get stung by fire ant before? Maybe you can give me a thumb up if you have ever been stung by fire ants. Some of you, yes. So today we are going to talk about fire ants. Especially, I'm going to focus on fire ant wars that happened before, and what lessons we can learn from the wars. And also, we want to talk about, you know, the current situation of fire ants in Virginia, because this is such an important population. We're going to talk about this later for sure. And you know, so today I'm going to be your storyteller. I want to speak a little bit about my qualification as a fire ant storyteller. So basically, when I started as a graduate student in Taiwan, and that was the first. That year was the fire ant was first reported in Taiwan. So you know, I was right there, you know, working on that fire ant project. So after, you know, before moving to Virginia Tech, I was in Japan. So a year after I moved to Japan, and fire ant showed up. So you know, everybody looked at me like, "Hey, Scotty, you don't bring your old friends with you. Oh, you know, I know you need some research money, okay?" But so that makes me feel like you know, I believe destiny or fate. You know, you can run away from the species you're meant to work on. Okay, so that's kind of my qualification. So that's I'm here today talking about fire ants. So Dr. Ivanov is my manager counterpart. we have been working together to map out some key, major invasive in North America. So I think he's going to be a very good, is a ideal person to talk about distribution and spread of fire ants in Virginia. Okay, so it's just 3 topics we're going to talk about: fire ant wars, distribution, and lessons, challenges, and futures. What we learned. So how did it start, this fire ant wars? So as some of you probably know, we actually have 2 species of fire ants here in the United States. So we actually have black imported fire ant arrived in somewhere in Mobile in 1910s. Okay, that actually black reported fire ants arrived first. Then 20 some years after, red imported fire ants that really give everyone trouble arrive in the same place, in this roughly the same place in Mobile in 1930s. Okay, and then people always want to ask, why Mobile? What's special with the Mobile? Are they, is this city like a fire magnet or things like that? Turns out, those 2 fire ant species were introduced from South America. And when they hitchhiking on the boats, they could potentially arriving in Mobile or New Orleans, because those are 2 major seaports back then. But it looks like New Orleans has been heavily infested by a different invasive ant, which is Argentine ant. So there was probably not much niche or resources available for imported fire ant to establish to actually grow their population. So that makes a Mobile a better place for them to actually settle down. So that's kind of a brief introductory of their history. So the both species arrive in Mobiles. Okay, and there's also another theory about, because black imported fire ant arrived first, and they display many native species already. So when the red imported fire ant came along, it doesn't take too much effort for red imported fire ant to take over what black imported fire ants have, because if you put them together to fight, red imported fire ants are always the winner over the black imported fire ants. So that's kind of how it starts. Okay, so after people start realizing, oh, there are some ants that can sting, that can bite, that can give you a hard time, people start doing something to respond to that. So they first thought of something like really toxic, like, for example, this calcium cyanide dust. They basically what they wanted to do is sprinkle every ants they come across. And later they have this, poison baits. They took this idea from, controlling mice, so they use this super toxic heavy metals, thallium salts. It kills human. Why don't it kills ants, right? But most of this control or like killing ant action are considered minor, because very few of them actually hit the targets. When they see ant, they control and they kill ants. So by the end of the first fire ant war, which is roughly 1950, we are looking at least 3 to 4 states that are already infested with the fire ants. 2 form, could be red imported fire ant or black imported fire ants. Okay. And here comes the second fire ant war. So they learned something, maybe they learned something from the first fire ant war. Maybe what we should do is, focusing more on those ants that are marching, because, you can kill the ants, more ants at once, right? Because they're marching, the easy targets. So basically they came out with this Crodan program. This Crodan is a synthetic but persistent chlorine insecticide. It stays in the environment, it doesn't go away. And finally, USDA realized this Crodan program, or Crodan, this insecticide does not match for fire ant biology. So this project only lasts for like 1 year. They terminate that. Okay. But
it is the never-ending search for food.
Okay, so that's just a video right there.
Has found insecticides.
So this is what happened back in the day. They see ants marching, they just, try to kill them with the Crodan. Okay. So it's a dust form, whenever you see marching ant, you just like, spray on them and they will die, of course. This is highly toxic to fire ants, of course. But the lesson they really learned from this second fire ant war is even they hit something really toxic to fire ants, on fire ant, they start realizing there are so many distant population popping up in different states. For example, in South Carolina, North Carolina, Arkansas, those, where those fire ant colony popping up is not something fire ant can be, fire ant can do by their natural dispersal in just 2 or 3 years. It has something else to do with that. Okay, so they're suspecting maybe it's nurseries where there's this potted plant with the fire infestation get brought from Mobile to somewhere else. Then you actually transported a fire ant colony fragment. So by the end of this fire ant war, they realized there are a total of 10 states that were infested by the fire ant, and mostly they found the fire ants is in area associated with like nursery stocks or like a plant those landscape companies. Okay, so taking what they learned from the second fire ant war, so they want to do something different. So they started a third fire ant war using what we call movement control. They start setting up this inspection stations along the highway or along the roads. They were trying to make sure those potted plants don't carry or don't have the fire ants in there, so they can prevent those fire ants from long distance movements. Okay, but when it comes to the actual fire ant control, they sort of have a different mindset, meaning, if the first, the second, if the Crodan that they use in the second fire ant war doesn't work, maybe they need a bigger hammer. Okay, so that's the mindset back then. So they started this heptacore program, super toxic active ingredients, very toxic to wildlife, aquatic life, and even livestock. Okay, but it still kills ants. Then what do you do for that? Right? So you can, you think this is still a right tool to kill ants, but maybe, in order to not kill too much wildlife, maybe we can reduce the amount and frequency of application, which they did. But what they found is heptacore actually easily degraded in the environment, and when it degraded, it's become more toxic and become more persistent in the environments, actually ending up in a lot of meats and milk. So with that, the heptacore program was ceased in 1962. And by then, it's the 12 million hectares were invaded. And we still have the reinvasion. I'll talk about reinvasions later. Okay. Then, so they're entering the fourth fire ant war. Okay. Again, people change their mindset all the time, especially if they learn from the previous experiences, right? So they feel like maybe it's not a size. Okay, probably it's different hammer was needed. Okay, so they come up with this. When I say they I mean USDA. They come up with this what they call perfect insecticides called Mirex. Again, it's still organochloride insecticides, but this is actually a very first prototype bait they have ever come up with, and USDA did see some early success with killing fire ants. So they feel like, oh, there's a hope for eradication. They're about to see the light at the end of a tunnel. But it turns out we're still like a long way from that, because it's Mirex is actually carcinogens, and it's more persistence than heptacore in the environment. Okay, then you guys know all those stories. Bioconcentrated, biomagnified in the foot web. So the EPA decided, we're gonna terminate this project because we cannot have that super persistent toxic stuff in the environment. So this Mirex program actually was ceased in 1973. By then, there has been 90 million hectares that were invaded by the fire ants. Okay, so by the end of the ant war, early 2000, a total of 15 states, approximately 0.15 billion hectares in the U.S. were occupied by this invasive pest ant. But what about now? This joint effort between my lab and Ivanov labs, we were able to map out, now this all entire southern states are infested by fire ants. And if you look on your right, that's the current fire ant federal quarantine map. So, and it's still spreading. So with that, I want to turn to, Cal, you want to share your screen? I want to turn to Dr. Ivanov.
Actually, I think I'll let you. I did not download the presentation, so if you can advance the slides for me, that. Next slide. So, thanks, Scotty, and good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. I'm Cal Ivanov, and I'm entomology curator at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. And Scotty said that I'll take more on the managerial approach, but as you can tell, he's more of the manager in this presentation. And I'll talk more about the distribution spread of the red imported fire ants along the northern front of its invasive range in North America. So although this species was present in parts of southern North Carolina as early as the mid-50s, it did not reach Virginia until 1989, when it was first reported. Actually, first nests were found in the city of Hampton along the coastal plain of Virginia. And the first published record, which will be the paper on your left, did not appear until 2000. So about a decade later. And from 89 to 1999, 10 years later, it has stayed somewhat local, but it has spread in the nearby cities of Newport News, Williamsburg, and Pocassin, and occupied something like 130 to 140 sites. Since then, until the mid-2000s, 2006, it was already expanding further south into the heavily populated areas of Norfolk, of Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach, and the number of infested sites quadrupled to over 540 individual sites. And these records in the maritime parts of Virginia are probably not surprising, given the fact that this is a cold-intolerant species, and the milder conditions along the coast have aided its natural spread. That said, of course, many of the reasons why the species spread fast in the area is because this is one of the most densely populated areas in Virginia, and that species were aided by humans pretty much by spreading sod or nursery material or soil to new areas. Next slide, Scotty. And in response to the increasing fire ant populations in the Hampton Roads area, the USDA and VDACS, the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, implemented a federal fire ant quarantine in 2009, about 20 years after the first record. And at the time, the quarantine included 9 independent cities and 2 counties that are marked in red in the top left map. Despite these efforts, and the quarantine, of course, made it illegal to transport fire ants or materials that may house nests or individuals into the areas outside of a quarantine zone. As a result of that quarantine, VDACS was no longer actually responsible for treating the fire ant mounds in the quarantined cities and counties. And despite these efforts, fire ants kept marching further west. And in 2019, go back to the same slide. So in 2019, 2 additional cities, Franklin and Emporia, and 5 additional counties marked in orange actually were added to the quarantine. That might have slowed things down a bit, but in 2022, the quarantine was yet once more updated to include 5 additional counties. Next slide. So at present, what we have is 11 independent cities, 12 counties here marked in red that are under federal quarantine, and there's additional 9 counties and 7 independent cities marked in yellow that have some infestation, but with the exception of Prince Edward County and more recently the city of Danville in Pennsylvania counties. These are mostly localized, or in the case of the disjunct records in the western part of the state, Giles, Montgomery County, City of Roanoke. These are older records, and we currently have no indication that there are established counties. So this was the situation pretty much back in 2022, and it's currently holding, although some indication that the fire ants are moving slightly to the west. That said, something more or less unexpected happened in 2022. Next slide, Scotty. Is that in 2022, Dr. Young was part of a team that recorded the first presence of the hybrid fire ant in Virginia, and these are hybrids between the black fire ant Solenopsis richteri and the red imported fire ant Solenopsis invicta. Maybe not surprising. I said unexpected, but not surprising, because the locality where those hybrids were found is situated only about less than 50 miles east of the counties in Kentucky in which the hybrid fire ants actually, surprisingly or not, were also identified back in 2022. So these could have easily been moved with farm equipment, soil, or any other material. Next slide. Back in 2020 and 2021, we did a statewide survey of fire ants in Virginia, and what we found was somewhat worrisome. On the top map that you see, the markers indicated in red actually point out to areas which, based on an earlier predictive model from 2005, should have not had fire ants present in those areas until 2080. So we were at that point about 60 years ahead of schedule. So fire ants were spreading into those areas, parts of Halifax, Mecklenburg, Lunenburg, Charlotte in the west, and Dinwiddie, Chesterfield, and City of Richmond and Hanover County to the north. So what we used predictive modeling to kind of estimate where things are headed based on current climate change predictions. And the map at the bottom on the left shows well, pretty much what we already knew. The areas in greens mark the areas that are most suitable for fire ants, and these are also the areas that, well, fire ants are currently present in. If the current climate change scenarios hold, most of the inner Piedmont, the central part of Virginia, will become suitable for fire ants, and that may extend all the way up to the city of Roanoke. And for the most part, what was saving us until now was the idea that the western, more mountainous area of the state are unsuitable for fire ants. But of course, with the current finding of hybrid fire ants, which there is some indication are more cold tolerant than the red imported fire ant, that scenario is further complicated. And next slide, Scotty. So fire ants do appear with some regularity or records. These are records from iNaturalist. They appear with some regularity further north. In some cases, like the record east of Columbus in Ohio, can be traced back to actually shipment of potted plants. So we know that there is no established population, but the more interesting records, next slide, are those in the DC, Baltimore, and Fairfax County areas. Records appear there with some irregularity, and there is indication of recently established population. Under, again, current climate change scenarios, most of the Atlantic coast and the coastal plain will be very suitable for fire ant establishment in the near future. But not only that, but much of the lower Midwest will turn to be one of the most affected areas. And that's all I have, and I'll turn things back to Scotty.
Okay, so what lessons or challenges and what can we go in the future in terms of, fire ant situations? So I want to quickly play these videos. This was a guy trying to control a fire ants population in his backyard. So he poured some gasoline there and is trying to set up a fire, trying to burn fire ants. That's a second try, didn't work. Okay, that's a third one. Just wait. It creates explosion right there. So this is what I'm trying to talk about. Mindset. The bigger the hammer, the better when it comes to fire control. If that is true, we would not see anything like this, like crazily rapid population expansion, along the years. Even we hit those fire ants with the super toxic stuff. So and most of those actions, the pesticide they use, they're insufficient. That's based on the insufficient understanding for fire ant biology ecology. So people sort of like learn, the bigger hammer doesn't work better. Actually, if you want to really control fire ant well, low toxicity baits is actually the right way to do, because you want them to, actually eat them and being able to like bring back to a colony and share all those toxicants with every single nest, every single member in the colony, including queen. So you would be able to eliminate a colony. So the size of the size of the hammer doesn't really mean too much, okay? And a bigger factor that explains why we never ever come close to eradication of fire ant is, most of control actions are considered temporarily and local. You only able to temporarily and locally decrease the fire ant population. And that's okay, because back then, people have this mindset, oh, okay, let's just kill the fire ant for now and waiting for the native ants to come back. And they will recolonize the area, so protect the area from the fire ants. But things don't work that way, because when you, control the fire in this core area, but you don't have that budget to cover all area, especially those surrounding areas, right? So, and you are expecting native ant to move back before fire ants do, but it's always the other way around. It's always fire ants moving back to a previously controlled areas, okay? So I think after that, they realized we need to slow the reinfestations. So they start establish some biocontrol agents in the under-managed area, surrounding area. And that does work a little bit until we found this, they put some viruses trying to, lower the dispersal potential of fire ants. But this virus actually do something different on fire ants. They actually reduce their foraging behaviors of fire ants. So they are not as interested in the baits we wanted to eat as much as those uninfected conspecific. So that's actually turn around against us, because if the fire ants are not eating baits, and those viruses are not gonna kill the fire ants right away. So it's, turns out the virus-infected fire ants are actually, have more advantage compared to uninfected. So in the future, we start having hybrids in Virginia, meaning, those hybrids are known to have more cold tolerance. So maybe those are going to be the population who keeps spreading northward. And he also, when it comes to long distance dispersal of fire ants, it's always us humans. Those ants are really good at hitchhiking our human activities, commerce. So, something movement control should be implemented. Okay, then the last thing I want to talk about is, that fire ants applied research is really the key. So we have to find an effective way to reduce the reinfestation potential. And we probably want to improve our baiting strategy to counter that reduced foraging behavior induced by viruses or other pathogens. And we need to make sure those baits we put out have some good level of species specificity, because we don't want to kill other ants, because those ants could be our, savior, because they actually compete with the fire ants. So with that, I want to conclude our talk. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. We're going to move into our combined Q&A section. So I'm going to ask our other two speakers to please turn off their cameras, and I'll have my co-moderators highlight you so we can kind of address them. I'm going to start with a specific question for you, Scotty and Cal. So are there any efforts to develop biocontrol for these species to kind of reduce their spread? And additionally, when fire ants are moved around in potted plants, is that the adult ants, or is it mostly ants that are eggs or larvae that are being moved?
I think I'm gonna go ahead and answer this. So, okay, there have been biocontrol efforts for sure. So like for USDA, they've been releasing forage fly. It's what we call decapitating flies, okay? Great biology because they lay the egg on the neck of fire ants and maggots hatch, they eat their way into the fire ant brain. And as soon as this maggot's about to pupate, the fire ant's head falls off. So that's why they have this decapitating fly name. Okay, so as most of these biocontrol efforts still work more like locally. So unless you have this area-wide control or area-wide like coordination between different states, otherwise it's still kind of considered local. Yeah. And also there are some pathogens like microsporidia viruses, but like I said, we just have to understand, you know, the effects of those pathogens on the fire ant biology before we can say, hey, this is compatible with the current baiting strategy. Yeah, so that's the first question. The second question is when fire ants are moving with the potted plants, usually there is a functional like colony fragments. So when I say colony fragment, I mean there's a queen, at least a queen or some larvae and some workers. Yeah, that's you know, that's what we call functional fragment, where if they got a chance to get to somewhere else, they can actually leave the potted plant, find a place and settle down.
Great, thank you. This next question is for Pete and Rick. So there's been discussion in the chat about seed and plant material sourcing, and people are wondering what kind of selection procedures or risk assessments do you consider when choosing the species that you're using, and also where you're getting your plant material from?
These are great questions. Yeah, and there's a lot of different aspects of that. And this really brings it back to the co-development aspect of this. So we have sophisticated models from Climate Change Tree Atlas to be able to start honing in on potential habitat shifts and things like that. But really working and localizing with managers to be able to understand what's unique about their stand, what's unique about the biophysical aspects of their soils, the topography, potential functional needs and management goals that they have. All of these, both environmental, geographic, and human dimensions, play into some of this selection. I love the conversation that's going on about Norway spruce, and thanks for Rick for bringing that up. I also want to just highlight that assisted migration represents a sliver of good forest management for adaptation. And then as we move along this line of we talked about the food groups, maybe Norway spruce would be a unique and specific tool or species to use. Oftentimes we're thinking about the modifications in terms of genotypes of species that are already there, or maybe just the modest bump in terms of a species that's maybe found just a little bit farther south. And so those things help to localize those decisions as opposed to maybe a rapid shift in terms of just dumping new species that maybe a model may project a habitat shift. And then the last thing I'll point to before I pass to Rick to share his thoughts. You know, we've done a lot of work with forest nurseries, both in terms of co-developing with foresters to be able to understand what resources do they need from forest nurseries. There's a comment in the chat. Nurseries do a good job of tracking seed sources, but oftentimes locating where those seed sources are tend to be a little bit opaque. And so working reciprocally with resource managers and nurseries to be able to help the parties understand, we really need to know the precise location where these seeds were collected to be able to understand what that means in terms of habitat shifts and stuff like that. And we start to see a little bit of a signal in terms of nurseries doing that, because this is their base. This is how they make their money, and being able to provide that resource is helpful. So yeah, Rick, take it away.
Well, I guess I would just add quickly that from the manager on the ground, we're sort of at the mercy of who's providing those seedlings. And there's, at least in the Northeast, there's not a ton of options that are local ones. So it's often coming from the Midwest, as I think Pete had said. So I think we don't have a lot of control of that, unfortunately. Maybe that will change in the future, hopefully. I think the other thing is, different landowners have a different tolerance for sort of risk or how aggressive they'd want to be in shifting species. And so, we as managers can respond to that by offering options, hopefully all within realm of good responsible stewardship. We're not going to plant things that are known invasive, et cetera. So, but I think it's all to say it's a fairly new, in the Northeast anyway, planting trees is a fairly new thing, at least in recent times. So there's a lot to learn for all of us, I think.
Okay, great. I want to take a moment to thank all our panelists again. I'm sure they're going to stick around for a minute or two. Maybe they can respond to a few more questions in the chat if anyone has any. But thank you all for coming to all these engaging presentations on co-production. So now I'm going to pass it off to Shika, who's going to move us into the next session. Thank you all again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thanks, Rick.
Hello, everyone. So it's 1:40 p.m. So let's move on to the next talk. So I am pleased to welcome Ella McDonald, who will be giving a talk on ash protection collaboration across the Wabanakik, evaluating outreach to promote brown ash caretaking. Thank you, Ella.
Thanks, Shika. Let me just pull up my slideshow here. Can you guys see that?
Yep, and as long as you click in your presentation mode. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as Shika said, I'm Ella McDonald. I'm a master's student in the Ash Protection Across Wabanakik Lab, or APCA. And I'm really glad to be here with you all to share the results of some of my master's work. But I also just want to recognize that I'm part of a much bigger effort that's been going on in Maine for 20 years. It started with Wabanakik communities, and it's involved a lot of other collaborators like the Maine Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and a lot of land trusts and conservation groups who have supported our work along the way, including my PI, John Daigle, who's a professor at University of Maine. And so I want to start with some context. This is a map of Wabanakik homelands, which is where we do our work in the APCA lab. And the little houses on this map denote the contemporary Wabanakik communities that live in homelands. And Wabanakik means the land of the people of the dawn. So that's where we do most of our research. And one of the first things that I learned in working with Wabanakik people is that there's been a ton of land dispossession. Wabanakik people now only own or steward 1% of land within their traditional homelands of Maine. They've been relegated on this map. You can see all the different colors that are divided by the 4 tribes in Maine who now own or steward land, especially the Maliseet and the Mi'kmaq only own very small amounts of land in Maine, and 94% of land in Maine is now privately owned, and 4% is under state or federal stewardship. But despite this land dispossession, Wabanakik people have maintained relationships to brown ash stands across the region, either through handshake agreement or stewardship actions, because they have the relationships with these trees. One through one of their creation stories tells that Wabanakik people emerged out of the bark of brown ash trees. And they also use brown ash trees to make baskets. So here's some pictures of the process of basket making. This is my lab mate, Tyler Everett, carrying an ash log out of the forest. Richard Syllaboy splitting some splints for brown ash, and Gabe Frey continuing to split more splints. And this is a basket that's made. And there are about 200 artisans in Maine right now, Wabanaki artisans who practice basket making, and a lot of them really rely on it for income. And so the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance was formed in the 90s to revitalize Wabanaki basket making. And they were one of the first advocates for brown ash trees. And because they heard from basket makers out in the Midwest about emerald ash borer slowly spreading east and the threat of invasive ash borer to these trees. And so they started organizing with University of Maine and others to organize protections for ash trees. And so I'll just talk a little bit about brown ash. It's a critically important ecologically important species. It makes up about 3% of forests in Maine, and that's all three kinds of ash, green, white, and brown, but brown ash is about 1 to 2% of that. Brown ash in particular, which is also called black ash, is really important for supporting hydrology along streams and in wetland areas. And when we're going to see loss of these trees, we'll also see loss of other plants and animals that depend on these ecosystems as the hydrology changes significantly. Ash trees also support 97 specialized species of invertebrates. And their leaf litter is really important for bringing nutrients into an ecosystem. Brown ash you can tell apart from green and white ash by its super spongy bark and the fact that it has no petiole on its compound leaf. And so I'm sure this audience is pretty familiar with emerald ash borer. It is an invasive beetle that spread to the US through Michigan sometime in the 90s. We don't know exactly when. And since then, it's been marching east and it's killed millions of ash trees in 34 states. It usually kills them within 5 to 10 years of infestation at rates higher than 90% for all three species, but it prefers to eat brown ash. So we're seeing mortality rates for brown ash at around 99%. And it arrived in Maine in 2018 and since has spread to 14 counties in the state, as you can see in this map. But we still have some really good, healthy stands of ash in our state. So we know that we're really in a critical window of time where if we can engage a lot of people in adaptive management strategies to protect ash, we can really make some progress on conserving ash in the state and keeping some stands on the landscape. So we knew that because 94% of land in Maine is privately owned, we knew that we needed broad participation from a number of different partners, not just tribal nations working to manage their lands, but conservation groups, private landowners, foresters, loggers, timber companies, many other stakeholders who manage ash stands across the state. We wanted to engage with using outreach and education. And in 2022, we named this effort the Ash Protection Collaboration Across Wabanakik. We're based at the University of Maine, and we have a few grad students and a few leaders. And our website can be accessed through this QR code if you want to connect with us. But one other thing that I'll say about APCA is that through all of our programs, we really strive to center the needs of tribal nations and the preferences they have around management strategies for brown ash. So in 2023, we had 6 virtual events, starting with an introduction event and then a cultural importance session where we hosted a panel of basket makers to speak about the importance of brown ash. And then we had 3 general in-person trainings. So we had 2 inventory trainings, as well as a seed collection training. And each of those had a corresponding webinar to kind of introduce people to concepts before going out into the field. We also had a genetic resilience session. And we concluded by having a seed collection training for tribal nations. And in total, we had 914 people register. And we had really good retention of participants. So over 70% of our participants attended 2 or more events, and 20% attended 5 or more of our events. So we had a lot of people come and stick around. And we had really broad attendance. So we had a lot of conservation staff participate, land trusts. We had a lot of educators come, foresters, state and federal agencies, as well as we even had some folks from timber companies come to our trainings. And we heard some feedback that people really appreciated that we brought in both Western perspectives and Indigenous perspectives to our outreach and education. But we wanted to go beyond that to not just look at these numbers and the feedback that we got to, and so the focus of my master's research was on evaluating the impact of this outreach and education in new ways. And so the first thing that we did in January 2024, after the conclusion of our programs in 2023, was send out a Qualtrics questionnaire to anyone who attended one or more of our sessions. And we received 289 valid responses for a response rate of 32%. And then I also wanted to go beyond that and hear more in depth about the impact of these programs. So I did 9 interviews with 10 people total last summer, and 7 out of 9 of these were in person. And I actually got to visit ash stands with folks and hear about how they're managing their brown ash stands. So one of the first things that we did in the survey was try to answer the question, what was the impact of our outreach and education on learning? And the way that we engaged with this was doing a retrospective pre-post knowledge test. And we did this by asking participants to self-report their perceived knowledge before they attended our program, and then their perceived knowledge after they attended our program. And then we ran paired sampled t-tests on those averages to see if there were significant changes in knowledge before and after our programs. This is an example of the cultural importance of brown ash webinar. And we found that for every concept in this session, there were significant changes in knowledge over time. Just to clarify, this was on a scale of 1 to 4. So 1 is low knowledge and 4 is high knowledge. And this was true for every program that we organized except for 1, that we saw significant changes in knowledge over time. This is another example of the Why Collect Ash Seed webinar. So this was one of the events where we saw some of the highest changes in average knowledge over time, and we also saw significance for every category. And people especially gained knowledge about storage options for seed collection, as well as seed collection techniques. But then something that's interesting is that folks who attended the webinar, many of them also attended the field trip, and everyone who attended the ash seed collection field trip had attended the webinar. And we saw that even though they came in with high levels of average knowledge, they also gained knowledge in the in-person event about the same concepts. And there were significant changes in knowledge. So that adds to the argument that these in-person events can add a lot more to knowledge and understanding of certain concepts. And so this was the only event for which we didn't see in some concepts, some significant changes. This was for the Tribal Nation Ash Seed Collection Training. And as you can see, this group came in with already really high average knowledge about reasons for collecting ash seed collection techniques, and storage options. So we didn't see significant levels of change between the pre and post for those concepts. And that's because this group had already been visited by master seed collector Les Benedict, who's from the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, in years prior. So we didn't see a ton of change over time for that. And so I really wanted to go beyond the survey and just those paired sample t-tests to understand what really stuck with people over time. And so in my interviews, I identified some key themes, and one of them was that the storytelling that was offered through this invasive species learning program really engaged with people's emotions. For example, this interviewee talked about one basket maker story who discussed the sound of pounding within communities and what that meant for the loss of ash to these communities. Talks about how that really made an impact on her heart. And then people also really recognized that the program was strong because it valued Indigenous knowledges and pointed out that that is something that isn't common in other spheres. So this person is commenting on how blending knowledges was really great to see in a university outreach and education program. And then we also found that people, many of the interviewees talked about how this program sort of focused their attention. So they started taking action around going out in the woods and looking for ash trees. This is a quote from a land trust who actually took another step and posted these signs up on their properties to help their visitors go out and look for ash trees and report them to their inventory. And then this person also commented that it was great to hear from not just the Western perspective on how to identify ash, but also from basket maker perspectives about how to identify basket quality trees, which have slightly different characteristics than just any brown ash. Only 5% of brown ash trees can be used for basket making. And that was really important learning for them around offering cultural access to harvesters. So we knew that people learned, that the survey told us that, but we also wanted to understand how people were integrating that learning into action or intention to take action. So in our survey, we also asked whether people had taken a number of different actions to protect ash within 1 year of participating in our programs. And that's what the blue bar in this graph shows, the number of people for each stewardship activity. And then the orange bar shows the sum of the number of people who reported that they would be likely to, highly likely to, or are already doing a certain stewardship activity. And as you can see, there's a little bit of a disparity between the people who had high intention to take certain actions and the people who had already taken certain actions. So we wanted to go a little bit deeper to understand, for the people who did take action, what conditions had they learned in, and how did that influence why they took action? So one of the first things that we looked into was whether people attended sessions in person. And we saw that those who had attended the in-person inventory session, 37% of them had done inventory within 1 year, whereas only 23% of those who attended the webinar had done inventory. So we saw a bit of a difference between those groups. And then also for the seed collection training, we saw the same trend, where those who attended one of the in-person sessions were slightly more likely to have done seed collection than those who just attended the webinar. And this, again, underscores the importance of learning with other people. We also wanted to look into collaboration as a condition that facilitated ash protection actions. And thankfully, we already had super high levels of collaboration within program participants. We had 124 survey respondents say that they were already collaborating with others around ash protection, which is 48%. And then 84% of respondents said that they would be interested in collaborating with others around ash protection. And this is really significant because we ran some analysis on those who were collaborating with others, whether they were more likely to have done a stewardship activity. And we found that 84% of those who were collaborating with others had already done a stewardship activity, whereas, sorry, the screen is blocking me, so I can't see the actual statistic, but 40% of those who did not collaborate with others had done a stewardship activity. So we can see that there might be a relationship between collaborating and actually taking action. And the same thing for relationships. So the importance that one of the takeaways from those in-person events especially the inventory one, was that 72% of people who participated reported building relationships with others. And those who built relationships at these events were more likely than those who did not build relationships to do ash inventory. So we saw that 50% of people who who built relationships at inventory events actually ended up doing ash inventory, and that percentage was lower for those who did not build relationships. So some key takeaways, we did see that significant changes in knowledge for most concepts within our program, but we also saw that high knowledge about the different concepts in our program did not necessarily lead to ash conservation behaviors. For everybody, we did see some good numbers for people within 1 year, but we just need to remember that this is a long-term process that's going to need to take multi-year repeated training of the same concepts. And I think that's true for a lot of other invasive species efforts as well. Another takeaway from the research is that it's really important to hold in-person events to foster these collaborative connections and relationships. These are all pictures from a Future of Brown Ash meeting that we had in October of 2024, where we brought together nearly 250 people participated either virtually or in person, and we had 150 people come out for a dinner, which was really exciting. And we got people, basket makers and conservationists, exchanging items that they had made with each other, which was really great to see. We also had drumming, so continuing to bring together these different people to work on this invasive species problem is really going to be the key to our success, as well as facilitating access to ash sands into the future. So that's all I have, and I just want to give a big shout out to all of our partners who make this work possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. I also forgot to mention that Ella was from the University of Maine. So wonderful presentation. I don't think I saw any questions, but there are definitely some good comments for you to check out in the chat. Our next speaker is going to be Kristopher Williams from the Capital Region Partnership for Invasive Species Management, or PRISM, and he will be talking about a quick and close look at the spiny water flea, Bithotrephes longimanus, a planktonic crustacean, and water lettuce, Pistia stratiotis, in warming waters. So with that, please take it away.
All right, thank you. And can you hear me okay?
I think so, and I see your screen as well, so that's perfect.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kristopher Williams from the Capital Region Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. We are one of 8 such entities in New York State. We are fully funded by the New York State DEC, and we provide a suite of services from education and outreach to response and restoration of all things with invasive species. I was asked a few months or a week, I don't remember, a month or 2 ago, to do a quick update, more along the lines of awareness and outreach regarding maybe some arthropods, animals, or plants, and our climatic changes with warming water. So I kind of relied on some topic content of what we observed from the last season, especially with reports coming from our partners and the general public in the area. And I think this could be valuable for people. So what I wanted to talk about first today is how climate change will interact with aquatic invasive species by warming waters and altering thermal regimes. We see that this will kind of increase the problems with aquatic invasive species and their impacts, like more predation and greater competitive advantages than the natives. We will also see an expansion of invasive species into new ranges, and there could be the potential for new pathways for invasive species introduction. What this will require is alternate control strategies and stronger prevention measures. So this pairs really nice with the RISC program and some of the research that they have posted. So I wanted to start with first, the species that came to mind when I was asked to do this was spiny water flea. I had an unusual amount of general public inquiries about what was going on in some of our surrounding waters in the capital region of New York and the North Country of New York, in particular the Lake Champlain region. Here you can see a picture of a fisherman with a, some of his fishing line, their trawling line, and I had at least a dozen calls, which I think is unusual, over probably in August of 2024 for this species of people just letting us know for awareness or complaining that they had these huge mats or pools of spiny water flea that were forming in areas that they were fishing that they normally don't. So spiny water flea is a predatory zooplankton that eats other zooplankton. So at those primary producer levels and thereafter, it kind of alters the food chain at the base level. So a real large concern for lake managers and the ecological significance area in that department. But again, we're getting calls based on recreational impacts. So, those two things are serious problems alone. During the day, they migrate into deeper waters, and at night they tend to surface for food. They like to hide from predators. So during the late spring, individuals emerge from their resting eggs in lake sediments. At certain conditions that are present, the female can go through asexual reproduction and producing clones. And typically when these conditions are favorable, we see some blooms of spiny water flea. And a lot of times they might actually exist in a water body in low levels. It's just when the conditions are right, they tend to have a large and rapid expansion of their populations. Something I learned in this process when taking a deeper dive is that they have unusually thick shells on their eggs that allow them to pass through their fish guts when they're predated on. And this plays a role with prevention because there's some issues with spread with bait fish and live wells and boating and recreational activity. So it's kind of good to share some of this information to help protect our waters. The spiny water flea is limited to water temperature ranges between 4 and 30 degrees Celsius. They have a certain range for salinity they like. And I know some of our northern lakes above us, like Lake Champlain, Lake George, tend to fall within this range. So they have suitable conditions to favor populations of spiny water flea. So lakes that may have comparable characteristics or changing attributes in the future with climate change may become suitable habitat, and we may start to see more of these phone calls, more population changes in conditions that are going to alter our water bodies. When I first started doing some of this invasive species work almost 8 years ago, spiny water flea was not a large concern in our region. We have a tier system, basically a tier 1 species not found in the region, where a tier 2, there might be less than 10 nascent populations that can be controlled or suppressed. But when these species get in larger populations, we like to say they're tier 3 or tier 4, where control may not be an issue anymore because it's cost prohibitive. So the rapid reproduction rate that these species have with, the right climate attributes, there is the impact for seeing more of them in the future. If you look real quick in the chart here, it is a prohibited and regulated species with New York Part 575. You can see in the capital region right now, it's listed as a tier 2 species, and that's probably from underreporting. The lower Hudson, a tier 1, there's probably reasons for that also. But I know over the years across the board, most of the other prisms, these were ranked like a 1 or a 2. And now you can see that they're tier 3 and tier 4. So it's just a quick snapshot of the progression of this species. I also want to throw in a macrophyte of concern. We have a couple of locations throughout the state where we have aquarium dumpings. Water lettuce is one of these species. It's definitely a warm water loving plant. And I just want to read this to you. The leaves are medium green, velvety, and form sweet little rosettes that are just 3 to 4 inches in width and grow 2 inches tall. Water lettuce provides many functions for your pond, etc., etc., etc. I actually pulled this off of a website where they were giving a description to purchase water lettuce. So you know, from the outside perspective, somebody that doesn't know better that this has invasive properties, you know, people are still purchasing this and they are still dumping it. We've had several aquarium dumps reported in our region. A lot of the times they're like people will dump them in parking lots, which I don't understand because they're usually at boat launches. And they're typically in the area where they could actually get into the water. I know people have done some of these dumpings away from larger water bodies in their immediate area. This picture in particular is from Round Lake, New York, where we actually found the plant free floating in the water. So we have some concerns. We know it was probably dumped there, but now are we concerned with, is this plant at a tipping point with the warming water of Round Lake that it was able to reproduce from seed? So they typically are very similar to some other aquatic invasive species that we see, like water chestnut, for example. Dense monocultures disrupt activities like swimming, fishing, and boating, and they reduce biodiversity and all the other suite of characteristics that go with that. So I just want to share that with you folks, that this is also a species that is not regulated in Part 575, but to look really quick across the other prisms, you can see it's a Tier 1 and Tier 2. So we're now monitoring this plant. We did an EDA survey of Round Lake, New York. We got positive hits for it. So now we're going to start focusing on doing surveys. Even though this is a tropical plant, you know, are we getting information that it's starting to become able to reproduce through seeds and become more problematic? It typically does not survive in colder weather or water temperatures. But again, it's something that we're looking for a change. Thank you very much. That was my rapid and quick 7-minute discussion for you folks.
Thank you for that talk. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I think we're just to maintain schedule. We're going to go on to the next talk. But if you have any questions, please drop those in the chat. The next speaker is Diana Albuja from Penn State, who will be talking about surveying shrub infestations in northern deciduous forests. So thank you, Diana.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you listen to me?
I can hear you and I see your screen. Perfect.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here. As you mentioned, my name is Diana. I'm a PhD student in the ecology program at Penn State. And today I will be presenting surveying shrub infestations in the Northeastern deciduous forest, which is basically a tool to evaluate them. Let me move. All right, so it is always good to remember the main challenges of the deciduous forest in the United States. We can have fire and fuels, unmanaged recreation, fragmentation, and as the topic of the symposium and the topic that is scoping my research, the interactions between climate change and invasive species. So first, I wanted to take a moment to talk about how this work is integrated into my thesis dissertation, which is called Japanese Barberry Control and Active Restoration Strategies for Climate Resilient Forests. Yes, it's a long title. And for this, I will be starting a field experiment this summer in this area in central Pennsylvania State College. This property is called Master Gap, and we have a huge infestation of the invasive shrub Japanese barberry there. So our idea for this is to remove the shrub, and after removing the shrub, we will test planting and seeding native species from local adapted species and from southern latitudes to promote the forest restoration, but at the same time to promote climate resilient forests. And all of this is wonderful, but as always, we need a lot of data to take these decisions. And that's why we set up a vegetation survey in 2023 and 2024 to evaluate the plant community. So basically, we focus on the understory to measure species diversity and species cover in quads of 1 per 1 meter, because that's our focus. And this is what my talk is going to be about, how we actually did this vegetation survey. Because we had a main question, which was, how much Japanese barberry do we have in the property? And I know that many land managers and forest managers have this question. So this was just an example of a vegetation survey of this project, but vegetation surveys are really important for restoration projects. And generally speaking, I'm going to show this diagram. Why is it important? First, we need for reference as the point we want to reach, or we also need the information to evaluate the status of the vegetation and the areas we're going to focus. So we also need information for the species selection, whether these species we're removing or we're planting. And we also need information about the post-restoration trajectory, right? So we can measure if we're doing a good job or not. And finally, to measure the success of the restoration project. As we plan our vegetation survey, there are two types of scenarios that we will most likely face. We're going to have whether a mature or a successional forest. Sadly, and we all know that due to invasive species and climate change exacerbating their spreading and the other factors I mentioned, in the majority of cases, we are working with successional forests. So we need to consider a different forest structure where the canopy is reduced and the mid-canopy and the ground vegetations are more abundant than in the mature forest. So considering all of this, the traditional methods must be adapted to effectively address the situation. Here are some examples of evaluating the understory of the forest. The most popular one, Japanese steelgrass. But then, for example, kudzu. It's so hard to estimate the abundance because it's not only understory, it also climbs the trees. So how we effectively estimate the abundance in the field of this plant. And finally, Japanese barberry, which is my species. So this is a photo of Master Gap. As we see, all the understory is completely covered with Japanese barberry. And how we effectively manage this or evaluate the plant population here, because we see clearly just two levels, the canopy and the understory and the story of Japanese barberry, and really nothing grows under this. And so far, there is not a clear method to assess this understory shrub infestation, and this is what I will present today. So some of the design considerations based on previous research and previous papers and publications. So this is from Webner 2007, that they mentioned that by comparing different methods, that if the abundance of invasive species increases with the detrimental of native species, the random method will be the best. So they are really advocating randomness. They also mentioned that the smaller plot size is better suited for dense vegetations. And in this older publication for Elsinga, they specifically put a mention in the practical side of the shape and the size of the quad. And they also mentioned that a combination with the random transects and systematic quadrats is the best suited for analyzing understory plants. So considering all of this, I found this publication and I made an adaptation for my method. This publication is basically a method to evaluate the forest restoration in the southeastern ponderosa pine forest from Forest Services. The method is a long line, but I will explain it. It's very simple. It's called point quarter method combined with transects. So it's basically, this is a representation of how it looks like. So it's a transect, and the initial point is the one that is random sized, and the other ones are fixed points at a distance of 10 meters. The total distance of the transect is 50 meters. In each of these points, we're going to have a quad, and we're going to measure species diversity and percentage of cover. This is my property, Master Gap, and these are all the initial points of the transects that were random sized and all the transects per each year. So here is how much I did in summer of 2023, which are 13 random transects, and in 2024, I did 15. And here are some of the results. So this is a graph showing the relative abundance of Japanese barberry. In the upper part, we have the first year, second year, And what it's clear that we are not surprised about this is that Japanese barberry is showing a lot of much like the abundance and the dominance is clear there. But what it was surprising for me was to find that the mean of the relative abundance in both years was exactly the same, 0.6, which measure over 1 is the 60%. So I think this reaffirms that we're doing a good job at evaluating the understory and the abundance of Japanese barberry. And the method also did a good job with Legistrum, which is border privet. We had the same result in both years, but we didn't have a good result in terms of the only native one that I had enough data to plot, which is Lindera Metsoni or Northern Spicebush. So in terms of overall richness in the understory, here's a accumulation curve in which I'm plotting richness versus plots. We're expecting here that as we increase the number of samples, we increase the richness of the species. And that's what actually happened, because in 2024, I did sample more and I found more species, especially 4 species. So yes, increasing the sample for this method increases the species, the richness of a species. So here are some of my conclusions. Coming back to the main question, how much Japanese barberry we have in the property, so far we estimate that at master gap, there is a 60% chance that any shrub within a given square meter will be Japanese barberry. We also figure out that this is pretty common, but it's also interesting to see in this particular case that increasing sample was helpful to detect more species, and that if the goal of the study is to register species richness, the method could benefit from introducing more randomness, as I mentioned some slides before, that some publications were advocating more about randomness of the internal points in the transects. So finally, some next steps. I will jump away from field data and will take remote data, later data specifically from all these years, and high resolution images. I'm gonna combine these both to estimate biomass on all these years, 2017, 2019, and 2021. I will compare this to my field data and see how the field data did. And I will also be evaluating the expansion or contraction of the infestation. Here's a QR code and a link to our crowdfunding page. So please keep supporting our project. As you imagine, funding restoration ecology is challenging, and we're always looking for friends and for supporters. This is me. Thank you so much, and thank you to my school and my university.
Thank you, Diana. It was a great presentation, and I'll definitely check out the website. So moving quite along, we have another presentation from Mackenzie DiGasparro from the Invasive Species Centre, and their presentation is called Incorporating Climate Change into Invasive Species Initiatives in Ontario. So welcome, Mackenzie. And I see your slide.
Awesome. Can you hear me okay?
And I can hear you perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for being here and for the organizers for having me today. I'm excited to have an opportunity just to talk a bit about what we're doing at the Invasive Species Centre to incorporate some climate change action and initiatives into our general invasive species work that is our day-to-day. My slides will change for me. Okay, here we go. So a bit about who we are as the Invasive Species Centre. We're an ever-growing team made up of terrestrial, aquatic, communications, and outreach experts. Our head office is located in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Batchewana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as longtime settlements of the Métis people. We're a nonprofit organization that mobilizes action against invasive species that harm Canada's environment, economy, and society. We were established in 2011, and we work across Ontario and now with some projects to both the east and west, which is really exciting. And we believe in working collaboratively with many partners, including our provincial ministries, federal departments, including the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and Natural Resources Canada. municipalities, conservation authorities, First Nations communities, and other non-governmental organizations, all to achieve our mission in preventing the establishment and spread of invasives across Canada. So to do that, we really connect experts, stakeholders, and communities to facilitate discussion, spread knowledge on impacts, share different resources, and more. And then we use these connections to catalyze action on the ground with programs and initiatives like our community science monitoring programs for beech leaf disease and hemlock woolly adelgid. And then we'll communicate evidence-based information using resources that we develop in-house to all relevant audiences and hope to more rapidly and effectively detect, respond, and control invasive species. So an example of this, our first oak wilt infection that was detected in Ontario in 2023 was by an Ontario arborist that was trained through one of our oak wilt training programs. So last year, we trained over 4,000 people through workshops and other initiatives and enrolled over 350 users in our online courses. Today, I'll be highlighting a few initiatives where we've been expanding our outreach on climate change, like I mentioned, but the majority of this work, admittedly, is not my own, but from my colleague, Emily, who's actually supporting this symposium this week. I think she's going to be moderating tomorrow, so please look out for her if you're going to be around. She's been involved with the Northeast Risk Group for a few years now, and what she's been able to bring back to the team with her involvement has been really, really valuable to us, and hopefully you'll see that through the next few slides. So a couple of initiatives that we've actually had ongoing for several years that some of you may have participated in. We've continuously tried to incorporate that connection and relationship between climate change and invasive species into these events, our annual Invasive Species Forum and our monthly webinar series. The forum event itself has grown immensely over the past few years with our 2025 forum that happened last month, bringing in over 1,200 individual attendees. This is mainly thanks to all the great work that's happening at these key intersections of these spaces like invasive species and climate change. And it really brings together a really interested audience. I'm sure the group that puts on the symposium will find the same. These sessions and keynote talks bring a really great audience and bring great numbers that we found. And we're really grateful to provide a space for all of these different talks. All of our forum and webinars are posted to our YouTube channel afterwards. I did a quick just search of our YouTube channel for climate change. And these are all of the talks that came up even from 7 years ago. So this is not really anything that's been new to the ISC, but I think now we're really focusing on trying to create a more cohesive program with directed efforts and effective action. So just some examples of some of these talks that can be available on our website that have happened, here and there over the past several years, some representation from the Northeast Risk as well. So grateful for all of you supporting our work as well. Next, I'd like to share our webpage and fact sheet, really playing the connections between invasive species and climate change. The fact sheet is really kind of a paper resource that is a representation of the website itself. So all of the same info on the webpage can be found on the fact sheet, and it gives us a great opportunity to share these at events that we're doing and really provide that connection between ecosystem resilience, climate change, and invasive species. Please check that out on our website. Oh, I went back. This is actually a project that I was able to do myself compared to all of the rest that have been led by Emily. This is a risk assessment we conducted in partnership with Natural Resources Canada and the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. And I included this in this talk mainly because it was primarily driven by climate change. Much of the risk involved that we discussed was primarily about habitat suitability and what's going to happen under climate change. These, along with the mountain pine beetle example that you may have seen on the last slide, are really great examples to showcase these current issues that are showing invasive species being impacted by climate change. So this is another cool initiative that Emily worked on last year. The Ontario Woodlot Association was working on a forest climate resilience course for landowners and practitioners And Emily was actually on the advisory committee for this and supported with a course lecture on the connection between invasive species and climate change. So this event was hosted, you can see, in 3 separate sessions last fall. They had quite great response, I believe. So really great to be involved in those not invasive species specific initiatives, but we can kind of get our work played in there as well. So it's really good to utilize those partnerships and make those connections and be able to work together and get this work out to the people that need it. So one step past that, we also have done over the last few years quite a bit of work with municipalities and other local governments. Prior to the work I'm sharing today, it was quite a few years ago, so I didn't include any slides, but we've been able to work on the creation of some threat rank tables and decision-making tools for some local municipalities that are really used on, we included some species that aren't necessarily within the region already. So we're looking at, what's moving within the region, what is potentially going to be moving to the region in coming years. And all of that information is included in these threat tables and assessments. So something we've been trying to include at that municipal level for quite a long time. But these are some more recent municipal initiatives that Emily has been leading. So she supported the City of Pickering's Community Climate Adaptation Plan with some comments regarding invasive species and the connection there. Emily herself has also contributed this climate change questionnaire to our municipal community of practice to try to get an idea of what local governments and municipalities are experiencing on the ground to try to inform our future projects and what work we should prioritize. And then finally, Emily was also able to comment on the provincial climate change impact assessment, which I was able to take a little read over, and invasive species were actually mentioned 23 times within this report, which I think is pretty good. We're also at times contracted to produce or co-produce invasive species management plans for municipalities or other local governments. So here we're kind of practicing what we preach and trying to incorporate relevant risk of climate change into that general work that we do. And I think I've talked in just under my 10 minutes. And I will say thank you. And you can check out our website and email me if you have any questions about the work that we do.
Thank you, Mackenzie. That was a great presentation. And yeah, so I think Ali has posted the link for the Invasive Species Center in the chat. And then finally, our last presentation of this session is going to be jointly given by Dillon Mulhern from the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust and Kat O'Connor from the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And they will be talking about, or the title will be Listen to the Beetles, Lessons in Adaptive Galerucella Beetle Rearing. So thank you and take it away. And I see your slide.
Awesome. Thank you so much for putting this on. Hi, my name is Dillon. I'm the Preserves Manager at Kennebec Estuary Land Trust, located in Bath, Maine.
I'm Kat O'Connor, and I am an Assistant Steward with Maine Coast Heritage Trust.
Awesome. Let's get into this. Okay, so kind of before we talk beetles, let's just ground us on when this project occurred. Maine is a big state. This occurred mostly in the mid-coast of Maine. So it kind of came about as a collaboration between MCHT and Kelt, because Kelt acquired a new property in Bodenham that had a tidal freshwater marsh with a lot of purple loosestrife in it, and that being a sensitive habitat, it was very hard to manage that population by just walking through and doing physical manual control. So Amanda Devine, the stewardship director at MCHD, had raised Galerucella beetles about 10 years ago using a guide created by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at Rachel Carson's, which is in Wells, Maine. So we kind of worked together as two organizations that didn't have enough capacity to do this on ourselves. So in Bath, we had a great ditch full of purple loosestrife, and MCHD had a good rearing site in Brunswick, Maine, at their Woodward Point Preserve that had water. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had done a bunch of releases in Scarborough of Galerucella beetles. So we had an existing population that we then started collecting in Portland. So the interesting thing about Galerucella beetles is, although they are released by humans initially, they kind of move up the coast. So our site in Bath actually did have Galerucella beetles, but a very low percentage. So the robust population in Portland is where we collected. We use iNaturalist to identify a couple sites and then some scouting to make sure that could happen. Awesome. Next slide.
So the Galerucella beetle is a biocontrol for the invasive plant purple loosestrife. The beetles and the plants are both native to Europe and North Asia. The Galerucellas are specialist beetles and they feed solely on purple loosestrife. So climate change has made rearing biocontrols very challenging, especially because the Galerucella life cycle is highly dependent on temperature and weather. Changing weather patterns created incongruencies between the beetles and the plant life cycles for us. So here you can see the overwintered adults that and they emerge in the spring. They start eating the loosestrife leaves and copulating. Then they lay eggs. And when the larva hatches, they decimate the loosestrife foliage. And then they move down the stems and pupate in the soil for just a couple of weeks before the adult beetles emerge, very hungry. And this cycle takes about 2 months. So we collected our purple loosestrife on May 9th, which was slightly later than the guide indicated, but it was the earliest time we could post-thaw. And we knew there was loosestrife present at this site, but it was difficult to find. There only one plant had any leaves, and they weren't true leaves, they were just baby ones. But we could confirm it was loosestrife because they have square stems, and you can like roll it between your fingers and be able to tell that it's loosestrife. And so then once we dug that up, we had a better idea of what they looked like and could continue our collection a little easier. As I said, there's not a lot of plant matter above ground, but they have very defined root systems. They have big root balls with woody, purple, shiny roots. And so we collected mature plants. You should collect as mature as possible plants with like big roots, and collect many more host plants than needed to prevent running out of food for the beetles and the larvae, which can be limiting. It was for us. So really just collect as much loosestrife as you have capacity for. When potting up the plants, we found that 3-gallon pots were best. So you split up the roots so they fit into those pots. We tried different sizes, but 3 gallons is the sweet spot. And you want to use fertilizer. Do not skimp on the fertilizer. You need to promote as much growth as quickly as possible on these plants. And then put them in kiddie pools, filling it halfway with water. And this simulates a wetland, which is where you will find purple loosestrife growing happily. And use the largest kiddie pool as possible. Smaller ones will dry out, and this will be a limiting factor of plant growth. And if in a public area, add a sign. People are very curious. They asked us a lot of questions. Of course, we're not always around to answer. So it's great to have a sign for education. And also so people don't think that you're growing invasive plants for no good reason.
So let's get on to collection. So before you actually collect your beetles, you definitely want to get your nets set up. Because once you collect your beetles, you're going to have bottles of beetles, basically. So we put nets over our pots. And then one critical thing I'm going to note, the guide suggests rubber bands. Please use ropes. Rubber bands break very easily, especially if they're in the sun, and your beetles can escape. So beetle collection, we did this on June 6th, which is the later range of the collection window as set out in the guide. Our loosestrife had barely any foliage at that time. It had been a very cloudy spring. And then the temperature moved very quickly from 40s in May to 70s. So we had a very small window where the Galerucella had emerged. And once they emerge, they start laying eggs immediately. So you have to collect them as soon as possible. So we collected in mornings that had about 50 to 60 degrees, collecting around 7 to 8:30 a.m. Later in the day, they become more active and start escaping. So basically how you collect beetles is you have your little bottles. You can see we have a plethora of different vessels. You tap the foliage and they just fall in. It's a natural predator defense that is actually really great for us. So we collected about 200 beetles, and then we put about 10 to 15 in each netted container. We didn't use a respirator. If you actually want to count them, you need a respirator. It's very difficult to handle an individual beetle. We did leave a couple plants uncovered that basically were our trap plants. So if anyone was to escape from our nets, they would go directly to that beetle instead of that loosestrife, uncovered loosestrife. And they would stay at our rearing location instead of seeking out other loosestrife away from our site. So kind of late June and July, things got really hectic. So we went from watering basically once a week the kiddie pools to when the larvae emerged in late June, they quickly decimated our host plants' foliage, basically defoliating them. So it had been noted in the guide that that would happen, but not at the larvae stage. So they ran out of food much sooner than we were anticipated. So we had to then start supplementing food using clippings of wild loosestrife in the nets. So moving into the pupae phase, where they go beneath the soil, it's really important to keep a consistent moisture level. And that's kind of right when we got hit by a extremely hot period with low humidity. So we were checking on them basically 2 to 3 days, making sure there's still water and trying to feel out when our beetles were actually going to come. We were kind of anticipating a slow hatching, or basically adult beetles slowly, but we came back the next day and we had hundreds of beetles at the top of the nets. So they emerged very hungry, and we had no food because we had already used all of our resources in the larvae phase. So we had to release them very quickly. So the process to release them is you take your whole plant, basically throw them in the back of a truck, go to your site. For us, we had a 300-foot pack in to our marsh, and then you take off the net and you leave the plants there for about a month, and the beetles come off your plants and then go to your wild plants. So a lot of lessons were learned in this first year. So it was a little messy, but we definitely learned a lot. So we're going to do this for 2 more years for a total of 3 years. That basically is what it takes to establish a new site. There may be, especially my site in Bodenham, it's about 5 miles from Bath. So there can be wild populations that are attracted to your new rearing site, but that's unlikely in the Rockport site. So big lessons: collect way more purple loosestrife than you think, prepared to be busy in late June and July. And the most important thing for us was going off of our beetles' life cycle. That really informed the timing for everything. Awesome.
And of course, this project would not have been possible without help from Amanda Devine, Danielle Arroyo, Eliza Stiniford, Emily Marshall, Mimi Osborne, Justin Nichols, Lila Bannon, Emily Stiniford, and Helen Ron. Thank you all. And we have to acknowledge the Biological Control of Purple Loosestrife Galerucella Rearing Guide by Robert Kenning. This was absolutely integral to our project, and if you decide to rear beetles, it will be integral to yours as well, I am positive. And do we have any questions? Let's see. I guess we have some jokes.
Right.
I love jokes.
Thank you for that presentation. And yeah, I think we did have a little fun with the bottles of beetles. But yeah, thank you. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I would like to turn it over to Ali for one of our favorite segments of the session, the Community Action Award. So please take it away, Ali.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Folks see my screen okay? Great. Okay, hi. My name is Ali Putnam, and I am a member of the Northeast RISC leadership team. I'm really excited to present the 2025 Northeast RISC Community Action Award that aims to recognize an individual or group for their passion and leadership in improving the community of support for invasive species action in a changing climate. So this year's recipient is the Jackson Audubon Society. Their work at the Hainleay Sanctuary has transformed a former agricultural area into a widely respected bird sanctuary. They have shown continuous dedication to this effort, including collaboration with multiple federal agencies and the Jackson, Lenawee, and Watashna Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, JLW SESMA. Invasives management in the sanctuary included clearing 6 acres of buckthorn in 2015 and followed by another cutting in 2016. Community invasive species removal has been a cornerstone of their work, hosting a variety of workdays on the site and partnering with JLW SESMA for the past 5 years to pull garlic mustard and spotted knapweed. The group worked with the USDA to remove invasive shrubs by utilizing prescripted burn management in 2023. In addition to invasive species removal, the group has also worked hard to replace native grasses and flowering plants to attract grassland bird species. This work has involved a partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service since 2000. Education and outreach are also important components of their work. Representatives from the JLW SESMA and the Northeast RISC leadership team have been hosted as a part of a monthly seminar series, and educational materials are posted at their kiosk for visitors to take and learn about invasive species. In short, this group has dedicated the past 25 years to removing invasive species and land stewardship in an area that is premier sandhill crane habitat, supported by enthusiastic volunteers. We're super fortunate to have Penny Lund, one of those volunteers, with us today to accept the award on behalf of the Jackson Audubon Society. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Penny. Oh, you're muted.
How's that? Better?
Good, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this award. It means a great deal to all of us volunteers at Jackson Audubon. And you said most of the things that I think I would have said, but I'm going to repeat a few just because I'm so proud of what we do. A little history first. First of all, Jackson Audubon Society is in South Central Michigan. And the sanctuary itself was founded in 1955. A man by the name of Caspar Hanley donated the initial 500 acres. He had used it to hunt. He was an area businessman. He even owned Hanley Brewing Company for a while. And after he was sort of too old to hunt, he donated the 500 acres to Michigan Audubon, and then named it after his daughter, Phyllis, who had died at a rather young age. So the official name is Phyllis Hanley Memorial Audubon Society. And in the years after 1955, Michigan Audubon, either through donation or purchase, has managed to grow the sanctuary to over 1,000 acres. It is the largest of all the Michigan Audubon societies. Jackson Audubon Society, even though we don't own the property, we manage the property alongside Michigan Audubon. We're fortunate enough to have 2 sanctuaries here in our county, Hanley's obviously the largest, and we have another one named Cape Palmer. The habitat is it's varied. We have grasslands, which you talked about, prescribed burns. We have a lake, we have a marsh, we have a fen, we have a hardwood swamp, and we have an area. The most recent efforts have been to try to return a section to oak savanna. So we've done a tree sale recently to remove the walnut trees in order for the oak savanna and some serious mowing to create that environment. As you mentioned, the real draw of Hanley Sanctuary for those of us that are bird watchers is the cranes. Michigan has a significant population of sandhill cranes, and Jackson County is probably one of the highest, if not the highest, of crane populations in the state. Our highest number that we counted was back in 2012, which was 8,177 cranes came into roost one night. We don't get numbers like that anymore. The fact that so much former agricultural land has been returned to marsh. They have a huge variety of habitats or locations that they can set down on for the night. But we will routinely in the fall collect about 3,000 cranes overnight, and it draws people from all around the state to come and watch those cranes come in at night. We have, I have to confess, I am relatively new to the sanctuary. I have only been associated with it for about 3 years. Since I moved to Michigan, but it is one of the most dedicated group of volunteers you will ever know. Since the 1970s, many of these people have been on a committee through Jackson Audubon to work tirelessly over maintaining that habitat and eliminating so many of the invasives. They've gotten grants and through whether it's the Fish and Wildlife, USDA, certainly SSMA, NRCS, Ducks Unlimited. So they have worked with a lot of different agencies, and we have done a lot to eliminate those invasive species, whether it's buckthorn or Asian bittersweet, garlic mustard, Dame's rocket, autumn olive, the hybrid cattail, and the honeysuckle. Last thing I'm going to say as far as tying that into climate change, as volunteers, we just sort of do the work. And we don't spend a lot of time thinking about the climate change. But what we have noticed over the decades is things that used to be northern species are now moving further north. And the southern species have begun to move in and take the place of those northern species over the past decades. And I guess that's it. We're just thrilled to be noted and receive this award because I can't begin to tell you how hard these volunteers work. Like I said, I'm new to it, but they work there all the time. They know every square inch of that 1,000 acres.
Great. Thanks, Penny. Really appreciate hearing that from you. And we really appreciate volunteers doing the hard work. So congratulations.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to share my screen again to wrap up. So we've had a great set of talks today. We started our day out with a talk by Catherine Jarnevich on the web tool Inhabit and the information it provides on habitat suitability to important management tools, such as species watch lists. In our co-production session, Peter Clark and Rick Morrill talked about the conceptual and practical considerations for operationalizing assisted migration of trees in northern forests. And Scotty Yang and Cal Ivanov shared with us the history on the introduction and spread of fire ants and the various forms of control used throughout time. During our contributed presentations session, we learned about brown ash protection from McDonald and spiny water fleas and water lettuce and climate change by Kristopher Williams. We also learned about surveying for various shrub infestations in the Northeast by Diana Albuja, and heard from Mackenzie DiGasparro on the incorporation of climate change in invasive species initiatives facilitated by the Invasive Species Centre. And our last presentation was by Dillon Mulhern and Kat O'Connor, sharing about rearing Galerucella beetles. And then we ended our time here celebrating the Jackson Audubon Society through our Community Action Award accepted by Penny Rund. And we're going to come back tomorrow to do it all over again. We had an incredibly informative and awesome day, and we're going to have another incredibly awesome and informative day starting tomorrow at 11 a.m. So please come back for another great lineup of talks. If you can't join us tomorrow, please complete the feedback survey that you can access with this QR code and a link in the chat. And with that, we will see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for being here.